My British Empire. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 251. In 1550, on January 25th, the winter cold gradually began to go away, but the air was full of dampness, especially in the morning and evening, which made people tremble in the bone marrow. The head of the 1st Regiment of the Guards, Knight Alexander, stood side by side with a cavalry company Knight Baldwin, standing on the hillside near the barracks, looking at the densely packed Catholic mob not far away as the main force resisting the religious reform. The number of mobs in the entire Catholic uprising reached 30,000, and unlike the anti-enclosure uprising army, the Catholic rebels formed a very tight connection. They are basically composed of Catholics, local militias, loyal farmers, hunters, and even some squires. They have received the support of some people in Devonshire and Cornwall, and their power has greatly expanded at present. According to Alexander Knight's investigation, the number of real elite rebels confronting the 15,000-strong government army has reached 5,000. In other words, these 5,000 people all have weapons, are not afraid to go to the battlefield, and have initially formed combat effectiveness. On the other hand, the government has no fear at all. Not only does it have an infantry regiment of 2,700 men, but it also has a cavalry company of 500 men. In addition to the tens of thousands of militias mobilized nearby, it has nothing to do with the 30,000 rebels in front of them. No thought of fear for his side's victory. The Alexander Knight has strong confidence in winning, but how to win with the least loss is a question that requires deep thinking. For the guards in his hands, Alexander Cavaliers is very concerned about it, and it is too precious. Your Excellency, Commander, we have been in a confrontation for a week. I don't know when we will act. The group of boys under me are already hungry and thirsty. Putting down the binoculars in his hand, Knight Baldwin, the cavalry company commander, stroked his beard and asked Knight Alexander, who was quietly observing, Mr. Company Commander, how have you dealt with the food looting of those mobs in the past week? Cavalier Alexander did not put down the binoculars in his hand, but instead observed. He asked Cavalry Company Commander Knight Baldwin rhetorically, Your Excellency, Commander, in the past week, I have led the good guys under my command to plunder or burn down 6 food shipments. The total amount is no less than 10,000 pounds. Speaking of this, Knight Baldwin immediately beamed, and narrated with a smug tone, Very good, these grains are what they need for more than half a week. Knight Alexander put away his wide and tender neck, raised the corners of his mouth, and said, looking at the proud Knight Baldwin beside him, I think the stomachs of the rebels are not feeling well this week against us. Yes, Your Excellency, Commander, I think the rebels don't want to confront us now, and they are probably discussing how to evacuate now. After all, a person with 2 legs will never be able to run with 4 legs. Baldwin tilted his head slightly, and his gaze shifted a few inches away from Alexander's body quietly, as if nothing had happened, and he used laughter to cover up something. Go on, Mr. Captain, I don't think they'll last long. Alexander's blue eyes stared at Baldwin, and he smiled like a blooming rose, which made Baldwin a little terrified and his face a little abnormal also. The cavalry company should be careful recently and keep an eye on them. If there is any change in them, tell me immediately. Alexander didn't pay attention to Baldwin's abnormality. His handsome face suddenly became serious, as if thinking about it. His eyes focused on Baldwin again. Yes, we will definitely inspect such things seriously. Please rest assured. Baldwin sat on the horse and straightened his body. Suddenly, he became a little stuttering, which made him a little embarrassed. I think, these few days, it's time to decide the winner. Knight Alexander looked puzzled for a moment, but he didn't take it seriously, and then he turned his eyes to the somewhat messy camp of the Catholic rebels with the lights on at this time. Even though Virio, who had led more than 1,000 militiamen, managed to maintain the camp of Catholic believers, the entire camp was still somewhat chaotic. But there is no way to do this. Most of the 30,000 people are farmers who have never been on the battlefield. No matter how good the teaching is, it is unavoidable among these 30,000 people. Less than 3,000 people had been trained by the militia and had been on the battlefield. After selecting some hunters and stronger farmers, he barely got 5,000 people. It can be said that the current Catholic rebel army was established and built by him, and it is full of his painstaking efforts. If he is the leader of the army, and Priest Tony Richard is the spiritual leader of the army, the two command the entire army together. But at this time, the 2 army leaders frowned and sat opposite each other, chatting with each other one sentence at a time. Mr. Virio, Our food situation hasn't been leaked. Priest Tony still has some pimples on his face. He is less than 18 years old, but he looks old. Yes, no one knows the specific data yet, but it won't last long. After all, the food can only be used for 3 days at most. After 3 days, if the food has not arrived, we have only one way to go: failure. Virio showed a bitter smile, shook his head, and said as if frustrated, "No, this is to restore the glory of the Lord. We cannot just fail like this. I will continue to urge the squires in Devonshire to continue to deliver food. I don't believe it. They will stop them all." Priest Tony stood up suddenly, looked at Virio with a stern face, and said sharply, "Okay, we will surely win, and the glory of God will shine on England again. This is our lifelong pursuit." Virio also straightened his back and shouted loudly, full of energy. There was a fervent expression on the faces of the two of them, ferocious and terrifying, and a majestic momentum like a rainbow. This is the power of faith. The next day, the government army sent people to keep an eye on the rebels who were huddled in the barracks, not daring to distract the slightest attention. On the other hand, the rebel army took advantage of their numbers and sent tens of thousands of people to cover the food delivery team, refusing to give the government troops a chance in this regard. The Alexander Knight inquired, and if he found that most of them were farmers, he would send the same number of militiamen to stop them facing the peasants. The militiamen defeated and captured the peasant army without any pressure, and brought back a large amount of food. Seeing this, the rebel army stopped doing this stupid thing and could only stay in the barracks and suffer. Chapter 252, Decisive Battle. Over the past 3 days, the Catholic rebels have used various methods to rescue 2 of the 10 food transport teams. The food can only allow the rebels to survive for 1 more day, which is better than nothing. In this regard, the rebel leader Virio and Priest Tony expressed helplessness. Feeling more and more aggrieved, the government army took advantage of its strong combat effectiveness to entangle the rebel army in the barracks, forcing them to maintain a defensive posture, and their morale became lower and lower. In this regard, the two of them decided to make a desperate decision to defeat the government army in one go, so that the people of England could once again be bathed in the glory of the Lord. All the soldiers gathered together and stood quietly on the school grounds. They raised their heads and looked at Priest Tony on the high platform with a fanatical expression and eyes full of worship and admiration. Although Tony's face was a little immature, but his footsteps were firm. He stepped up to the high platform step by step. His eyes were dignified, and his whole person seemed to be covered with a kind of sacred brilliance, which made everyone in the audience even more excited and fiery. Even there are people below who are shouting the word Santoni loudly to express their admiration for the Priest Tony, and it seemed that under the influence of other people, the shouts of Santoni became louder and louder, and finally everyone shouted in unison, hysterical. On the other hand, Virio did not choose to stop it. He understood that the more fanatical the soldiers, the greater the possibility of victory in this war. Adding a holy word to a person's name is the exclusive vocabulary of Catholic saints, and it is difficult for even the Pope to obtain it, let alone Priest Tony. Canonization is a technical term in Catholicism, which is an extremely glorious and solemn matter, and the status of a saint is even higher than that of the Pope. Canonization is also called canonization, that is, after certain investigation and verification procedures, the Pope of Rome issued a decree announcing that the names of one or some deceased Catholics be included in the roster of saints. That is, canonize them as saints, and require Catholics to regard them as models, to worship and follow just like our model workers. The saint is a model Catholic, and the Pope asks Catholics to emulate him in every believer who is included in the roster. Not only must his portrait be enshrined in the church, but also believers should kneel in front of his portrait and chant prayers, begging him to pass on his request to God. Moreover, every Protestant can also take his name as his baptism, holy name, when he is baptized. Of course, the most glorious thing is that their names will have a prefix of the word holy, which is used to show the difference between them and ordinary people. Saints are divided into 2 forms: refined saints and martyred saints, but Priest Tony is currently not one of them, and it is illegal to call them saints at this time. No brainless person dared to say that, and instead joined the cheering team. He pressed his hands, his voice gradually subsided, he cleared his throat, looked at the densely packed heads, and said without hesitation, "Gentlemen, this time we are gathered here, not for ourselves, but for England, so that the omnipotent and omniscient God may let the glory of the Lord shine again to England, so that we, the lambs of the Lord, may bathe in the grace of the Lord. Let us unite together and eradicate those heretics who defile the glory of the Lord. Lambs of the Lord, let us act. Our Lord will bless us. Long live! Long live!" Priest Tony blushed, raised his right hand, and shouted loudly at this time. The people nearby also shouted loudly, and the people behind who heard nothing also followed without hesitation soon. 30,000 people shouted in unison, and the voice pierced into the sky, and the birds flying in the sky hurriedly flapped their wings to support the sound waves. And what is more shocking to these is the government army in the confrontation. The government army of 15,000 people was shocked by the unison shouting and palpitations in response. Knight Alexander's handsome face froze for a moment. He knew that the time for the decisive battle had arrived. Order to go down, let the kitchen prepare enough bread and meat for all the soldiers, and wait for the guys to return in victory. A servant did not dare to neglect Knight Alexander's order, and hurriedly ran to convey it in response. On the other side, militia captains from other counties stood respectfully aside, their eyebrows lowered, not daring to have any meaning to his order. Some elderly people present could still recall in their minds the heroic achievements of this handsome knight on the French battlefield, but this time, the Knights of Alexander gathered all the militiamen and armor together, including the guards. The total number reached 5,000. And they also placed the tall ones at the front as shields. The cavalry were required to wander around, find the rebels' weaknesses, and launch a fatal blow. The two armies slowly walked out of their respective camps and came to the battlefield of the decisive battle. Virio, as the coach, stayed at the forefront of the army according to the usual practice at this time, riding a horse with a calm expression, and commanding the fight under the protection of a kind of attendant. However, the Alexander knight was not like this. Instead, he stayed in the army wearing heavy armor and looked at the gushing rebels with a calm expression. Virio, who was rushing forward, was getting closer and closer to the government army, and his curiosity became more and more intense. But how could the horse that rushed out be able to return easily? Just when the rebels approached the government army 300 feet, about 100 meters, a burst of gunpowder smoke suddenly appeared in the government army, and the air was filled with the smell of sulfur. When Virio was surprised, he rushed to the front row and fell down a dozen at once. With the help of the offensive, the rebels continued to charge forward. After 2 rounds of shooting, there were only more than 200 cavalry. But this time more than 80 people fell. In other words, in front of the government army, half of the cavalry team was dead. The rebels were stunned by the sudden casualties and noise, and stopped. Seeing this, Virio could only shout loudly, which made the rebels move on. The musketeers quickly retreated to the rear, and the infantry in armor came to the forefront. The swarming rebels rushed forward, like 2 stones colliding with each other, sparking violent sparks. Blood and corpses became the main theme at once. The armored infantry struggled to stop the rebels who wanted to collide with the rear, and the longbowmen in the rear and the longbowmen of the rebels on the opposite side fired at each other, canceling each other out from time to time. The pikemen stuck out their gun heads from the gaps, giving the shocking rebels a chill. However, the impact of the rebels was getting bigger and bigger, and the armored infantry in the front row gradually became unable to hold on, and the entire army might be dispersed. Chapter 253. The hottest circuit judges. The number of Catholic rebels reached 30,000, while the government army was less than half of them, and the advantage of numbers was brought to the extreme. There are only 2,000 or 3,000 people in the narrow front, but it is too much pressure to withstand the impact of tens of thousands of people. His eyes were covered with binoculars, but Knight Alexander's beautiful eyebrows were frowned, with a very bad expression on his face. Under his gaze, these mobs shouted loudly one by one, with ferocious faces, like devils from hell, regardless of casualties, one after another, charging the army, completely overwhelming them in terms of momentum. He knew that he had miscalculated and was too cautious and conservative. He should not respond passively, but should use his powerful combat power to directly rush over and defeat this group of mobs forcefully. Pursing his lips, Knight Alexander observed carefully and saw that the 200 cavalry assembled by the rebels were completely trapped in the army. A smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he waved to Knight Baldwin, who was doing the same. Your Excellency, company commander, at present, the cavalry of the mob is completely abolished. Now, you immediately lead the cavalry, insert into the rebel army from behind, and disrupt their formation. Afterwards, after we counterattack, use the speed of the horse to immediately take down the leader of the mob, and don't let them run away. Yes, Mr. Commander. Knight Baldwin saluted, and left quickly without saying a word in this regard. The Alexander knight's eyes moved slowly with his vigorous body, and then gradually retracted, and his eyes began to look at the fiercely confronting 2 armies again. The 2 armies slowly became entangled, and the soldiers began to fight close to each other. Even the musketeers put down their matchlock guns and took up weapons to fight. At this time, the longbowmen put away their large-scale projections and could only aim and shoot secretly. At this time, The fanatical expressions on the faces of the rebels gradually dissipated, and their actions were no longer as intense as before. Cavalier Baldwin rode a horse and led a cavalry force of 500 men, directly into the heart of the rebel army. The solid military spirit of the rebel army suddenly began to shake, and some people even began to look back. Frequently seeing this, Knight Alexander knew that the time had come. He rode his horse, shouted slogans, and led the people around him to puff up and attack forward all the government troops so that the bosses on their side had acted. At this time, more than 10,000 people took action, and the defensive position instantly turned into an offensive. Vario rushed forward, clearly feeling the change in the momentum of the entire battlefield. He was suddenly startled. He understood that his own advantage no longer existed. Like Vario's mood, England's calm waters are now turbulent, which is frightening. East Sussex, a county separated from Sussex, was originally integrated with West Sussex, English name, East Sussex. It is a county in the southeast of England, facing the English Channel in the south, with a strong commercial atmosphere, and its economy is at the forefront among the counties in England. But in his security committee, he has been controlled by a group. This group is different from the temporary union of the four major families such as Matthew, but a long-term political alliance that has lasted for generations, interests and friendship, allowing them to maintain a close relationship with each other if it was in the past. You ask Sir Thomas Pelham, what do you need to do in a day? He will pinch his grey beard and say to you without hesitation, horseback riding, hunting, having dinner, reading a book. Simple and comfortable. For a person like him who has worked hard all his life, this is the most suitable life for him. But now, if you want to ask him, he can only put on a bitter face, and still say to you without hesitation, go to the Anti-Roland Committee, go to the Circuit Court to see the judge. That's right. When the incident in Oxfordshire came out, the whole of England was shaken. The people at the bottom were surprised by the boldness of the gentleman, but the gentlemen were surprised by His Majesty's stern measures. Visit casually on the street and people will unhesitatingly tell you which institution is hottest in East Sussex at the moment. The Circuit Court is the main figure of the Security Committee. Thomas Pelham has linked up with a group of relatives and friends, including Anthony Stapley, Henry Shelley, and several families headed by Thomas Parker, all of whom are his political allies. Formed a security committee centered on him. It can be said that the voice of His Excellency the Magistrate is not as loud as his in the Magistrate Committee, and this situation has brought great benefits to their group, which has made this group more and more consolidated. However, this situation was suddenly broken at this moment, and a movement of judicial enclosures swept across England, which had formed a political trend, and it could also be said to be a political catastrophe. Originally, news came from Oxfordshire that Edward was going to ask the Palace Intelligence Service to review all enclosures in England in one fell swoop. However, as soon as Jack heard that His Majesty the King had this idea, he immediately sent a letter, tactfully rejecting this opinion, indicating that the development of the Palace Intelligence Department was not enough, and his own ability was not enough to lead and provoke this nationwide movement. It was only then that Edward came to his senses that the development of the Palace Intelligence Service was still unable to support this national cleanup activity, and the Bloodblade located in the Intelligence Center was too complicated to handle this matter. Therefore, he could only let the Privy Council issue a decree in the name of the King to remove the other two circuit judges of the Southern England Circuit Court on the grounds of dereliction of duty and directly demote them to civilians. And 3 people were screened from the Royal Court in London, and 3 circuit judges were resent at this moment. The other 5 circuit judges were terrified, staring at Jack and his party in London and Oxfordshire, praying silently in their hearts. At this time, a decree came from London. The King's request: all circuit judges must conduct strict inspections, and within 3 years, they will play the role of circuit courts. And those gentlemen and nobles who have not paid the enclosure fee to the Anti-Enclosure Committee will use the law to conduct necessary trials, according to the Oxford Law. The county's sentence, as a case. As a result, all the circuit judges could only keep their minds tied and non-stop convene all the families participating in the enclosure, and let them come to the court for trial at the prescribed time. And as the central figure of the Security Committee, Thomas Pelham certainly wouldn't spit out a mediate, and even cut off the equivalent amount of meat as compensation. This is not an easy thing to do. However, he chose to invite the judges out for a serious and pleasant gathering before the trial period, but the judges didn't have the guts to do so. So he could only come to the station of the circuit court in person, discussing and communicating again and again, hoping to reduce losses. Chapter 254. Leisurely. Of course, Our Majesty the King also anticipated this situation, entrusting favors, spending money to bribe, and buying, These are all inevitable things after becoming an official, and if some judges deliberately ignore, or even cover up, it is possible that our king's measures to weaken local power will be thrown into the void. He did not imagine the morality of all circuit judges to be selfless. Even at this time, officials in England have always regarded impartiality as a behavior fashion, and people also use this as an evaluation standard for officials. Everyone looked as if they were very honored to serve His Majesty the King, and they regarded their official image as clean and honest. As for this kind of thing that is one thing on the surface and another thing on the back, it comes from the kings of later generations. That is the door. The human heart is the most difficult thing to figure out. Therefore, Edward directly ordered the Palace Intelligence Office to supervise and strictly prevent the judges from committing malpractice for personal gain. This is also the reason why the circuit court is full of people. The gentlemen and lords everywhere were either arrogant, entreating, or indifferent to the conduct of the assizes. But one thing is certain, England at this time is in turmoil. There are mobs opposing enclosures in the east, Catholics rebelling in the southwest, and the counties where there is no war are panicked and undercurrents are surging. Our Majesty the King calmly brought a large family to the most luxurious Hampton Court Palace in England, which is next to the Thames River, for fishing. Unlike his father, Henry VIII, Our Majesty the King no longer frequently moves to the palace, but spends most of his time in the City of London. Over the past few years, London, the political center of England, has been truly determined. Of course, this is also our young king, who invented the cesspit, built a large number of toilets and cesspit, and strictly ordered all the maids and guards not to defecate anywhere. In this way, the Whitehall Palace in London no longer often overflows with feces and urine, and can accommodate a large number of people for a long time. Of course, this also made the dung diggers extremely tired, and every day they had to transport a large amount of excrement from the palace outside the city to the manor belonging to His Majesty the King. Do your part to make those crops thrive. This time, nearly 500 court personnel, including Princess Elizabeth, Queen Mary, and 5 little Marys, moved to Hampton Court Palace. Winter is gradually leaving, and the gentle Thames River is still as clear as ever, and there is no ice or anything. But the water volume is a little dry. Edward and the girl who was 1 year older, Princess Elizabeth, who was 19, walked side by side, chatting from time to time on the way. The Queen Mother Mary walked at the end, looking at the little Queen Mary with a smile on her face, and the 5 Scottish Mary Flowers who walked in the middle, chatting freely, seemed to say something funny, and a crack appeared on her delicate face. Between the cracks, wind chime-like laughter spread in the team. Seeing this, Edward turned his head to take a look, and then said to Princess Elizabeth, who was jumping up and down, and said, "Elizabeth, is there anything good going on recently? So happy." Suddenly, Edward's crisp voice came from beside her ears. Elizabeth stopped in her tracks, turned her blue eyes to her younger brother, and said, "It's nothing. I just remember that I haven't seen the Thames for a long time, and I feel a little happy." The princess's bright and beautiful eyes suddenly stared at Edward, looked at the choked His Majesty with a half smile, and asked then, "My dear brother King, what do you think is wrong with me?" Edward laughed dryly. Of course he understood the implication, and then said in a voice as thin as a mosquito, "I thought you had found your husband." "What? Speak louder. I can't hear you clearly." Princess Elizabeth immediately raised her beautiful light eyebrows, looked at Edward at the side with some toughness, and questioned. "Nothing, nothing. What you said is about the same as what I thought." Edward took a deep breath calmly, grabbed the shoe with his right foot, and said in a calm tone, "Humph." Elizabeth crossed her arms, turned around, walked around on her own, and said in a tone that "You are very honored. I am in a very good mood today, so I will forgive you once, and I will not be so good next time. Good luck." 19-year-old Princess Elizabeth walked briskly, leaving Edward behind like the wind. Looking at the picture of Elizabeth walking briskly with her long skirt fluttering, I couldn't help but sigh in my heart. And he looked at his gradually growing body, clenched his fists, moved his arms, squeezed them with his hands, and could feel a hard feeling. This feeling, in Edward's opinion, is really wonderful. He just came here through time travel, and the sick body made him miserable. It can be said that he basically spent the first 2 or 3 years in bed, and after 10 years of uninterrupted exercise, he already had a body that was no different from that of ordinary people, even much stronger than those nobles and malnourished commoners who had their bodies hollowed out. Edward reckoned in his heart that he might be very different from the sick Edward VI who died young in history. At least he would definitely live past the age of 16. After all, he was almost 14 this year. Then, there will definitely be children in the future, so I won't cut off my children and grandchildren. Stopping in place, Elizabeth's figure gradually stopped, while Edward glanced at his crotch, but his thoughts diverged further and further. Edward What are you doing?" At this moment, he was standing still, but a delicate voice came from his ear. A smile appeared on Edward's face. He raised his head, looked at the 9-year-old little Lolita, stroked her smooth long red hair, and said softly, "I'm waiting for Mary." "Really? Edward is the best." Little Lolly raised her head. Her bright eyes were narrowed into slits, matching her chubby little face. She looked extremely cute. Edward didn't resist the temptation either. He gently rubbed his pink face with his right hand. It felt so smooth and tender. "Damn it. Don't rub Mary's face, it will swell up." Little Lolita patted Edward's right hand, trying to stop his ravaging behavior, staring at him tightly with dissatisfied big eyes. Angrily, "Okay. All right." Edward smiled and let go of his right hand, and obeyed her, which made little Lolita smile. "Okay, let me see if Mary's gained weight. You've eaten a lot recently. Don't turn into a chubby pig." Edward bent over, hugged the little girl who was outstretched with both hands, weighed it, and it was indeed a little heavier. Little Lolita was very dissatisfied with Edward's words, and with a disapproving expression on her face, she said angrily, "Mary's not a little fat pig. No way." Chapter 255 Small Talk. As she said that, after being put down, little Lolita took her 4 little followers and ran towards Elizabeth in front of her, ignoring Edward. The other 4 little Lolitas were polite, holding their skirts with both hands, and curtsied respectfully to Edward. Seeing this, Edward showed a kind expression, smiled and nodded at the 4 of them, looking like a big brother, which made the 4 Marys feel very cordial afterwards. Like a lady, the 4 of them returned a sweet smile to him, and then quickly chased after little Lolita. Seeing the beautiful figures running ahead, Edward squinted his eyes to cover the glare of the sun, and his mood immediately improved a lot, and he relaxed. He turned his neck, activated his body that had been stiff for a long time, and took a deep breath of the humid air. Natural, harmonious, and beautiful. This was his feeling at this time. But at this time, the Queen Mother of Scotland from France stopped not far behind Edward, lingering, with a look of hesitation on her face. The king, who twisted his neck, of course saw this scene, thought for a moment, took firm steps, turned around and walked over without the slightest hesitation. Queen Mary, who was lowering her head with a calm face, naturally noticed the sound of approaching footsteps. She raised her lowered head in a blink of an eye, as if she had just discovered Edward, and covered her red lips in surprise. "Your Majesty, why did you stop? Is there anything you can think about?" Although Edward was only 14 years old, his height was about the same as that of the Queen Mary, who was in her 30s. He raised his head slightly, looked at the plump Queen Mother. His eyes were full of concern, and he said without blinking, "It's nothing, Your Majesty." The Queen Mother Mary showed a flattered look at His Majesty's concern, pulled the white collar that covered her long hair with her right hand, and said with a light smile, "Your Majesty, I can't be called Your Majesty. You only need to call me Mrs. Keith." The title Your Majesty, in Europe, is basically an honorific title. For kings, queens, princesses, princes, etc., they can be called His Highness. Queen Mary lowered her head gently and said softly. Seeing Queen Mary, who was cold-eyed at him before, now showing a friendly smile, Edward felt more and more at ease. After almost 2 years, this stubborn woman finally recognized the truth. "Okay, Mrs. Keith." Edward nodded and agreed. "Naturally, it's just a title, Mrs. Keith. The relationship is closer than before. Why not do it, Mrs. Keith? Let's go. Mary is a bit naughty. I'm afraid Elizabeth can't take care of her." Edward and Queen Mary walked side by side, looking at Queen Mary in a white knee-length dress. As she walked and moved, the 2 peach petals were really alluring, and the smell of a mature woman seemed to directly hit the nose, tempting someone. Edward glanced sideways for a few times, pretended to be indifferent, tilted his head slightly, approached a little distance, and said softly, "That's right. Mary has been in London for the past few years, and she has been quite naughty." Queen Mary didn't see someone's sneaky gaze. She looked forward and sighed hearing this sentence. Edward was a little embarrassed, touched his upright nose, pretended not to understand the meaning of the words, and replied mechanically, "Yes. Yes. Mary is getting more and more mischievous. I am so sorry for your madam." Queen Mary stepped on the green and tender grass, and after hearing the king's words, she did not refute or sarcasm, but expressed some words of thanks. "However, thanks to Your Majesty, you have done so many things for Mary. In the past few years, this is probably the happiest time for Mary. This is also the best ending for our perishing royal family." For these seemingly cruel words, Edward did not continue going on. "This is very embarrassing for Edward. Strictly speaking, Scotland still exists. Although it is nominally led by Edward and little Lolita, in fact, it still has its own independent government, judicial power, and administrative power, and it is still firmly in the hands of the Scottish people inside. However, England also controls the diplomatic, military, and legislative powers. As a country, it is actually dead. Edward didn't want to talk about this topic. After all, Scotland was merged by himself, and the mother and daughter were kidnapped to England, and freedom was restricted after the king didn't answer. The two came to the reserved place together with a silence at this time. Lucy had arrived ahead of schedule, arranging the manpower of the palace and setting it up. When Edward and Queen Mary arrived, they saw Princess Elizabeth lying relaxed in an armchair on a wooden platform built by the Thames. The top of the wooden platform is a piece of cowhide cloth kneaded and sewn from cowhide, which blocks the sun and prevents sudden rain. Thick guardrails are installed around it, and more than 30 strong and powerful guards stand around, looking after the few children who are running around. 8 wooden rocking chairs invented by the king were placed solemnly in the central area of the wooden platform, near the water. The rocking chairs were also covered with woolen blankets, which looked extremely comfortable. Your Majesty, you are here. Lucy, wearing a white skirt, saw the young king coming, hurriedly approached, showed a sweet smile, and bowed. Well done, Lucy. Edward walked around, looked at the wooden platform, looked around, and nodded with satisfaction. Your Majesty, this is your place. Seeing His Majesty's satisfied face, Lucy's smile became brighter. Twisting her slender waist, she led Edward to the central position. Afterwards, she patted the snow-white and soft blanket with her hands, as if she wanted to pat away the non-existent dust, and then she gave Edward a gesture of invitation in this regard. Edward sat down without hesitation, put his feet on the stool in front of him, and slumped on the comfortable recliner, not wanting to move. Edward, why are you here now? Princess Elizabeth, who was lying on his left, turned her head, her red lips slightly parted, and she looked at Edward motionlessly, and asked, It's nothing, it's just a few words with Queen Mary, it's just a delay. Edward turned his head, looked at Princess Elizabeth, who was just like him, shook his head, and said casually. Seeing that she was speechless, Princess Elizabeth immediately straightened her head, closed her eyes, and enjoyed it comfortably. Edward's gaze was suddenly attracted by Elizabeth. Her Majesty's size was like a jade bowl turned upside down, which looked extremely attractive. Chapter 256 Gift. Ask for tickets. Ask for subscription. A 19-year-old girl is fully developed, and all the mechanisms of the body are already sound. She has the body of an adult woman, but she has a youthful atmosphere that belongs only to a girl. Coupled with her long-term influence of aristocratic life, even when she is lying down, her whole body is full of aristocratic elegance. Moreover, she was wearing an ordinary girl's tight knee-length skirt and a sable fur coat on the outside. She was lying on the recliner. From the side of Edward, she was extremely sexy in this regard. Edward, who is only 14 years old in this body, is in puberty, and the male hormones are beginning to flourish, and his whole body is a little excited. He hurriedly turned around, lay on his side, covering up the embarrassment of his body, and then breathed a sigh of relief. What am I thinking? This is my sister, Edward. You have to calm down, calm down. He patted his hot face, and the rapid heartbeat in his chest slowly calmed down. Edward, why don't you fish? At this time, the cute voice of little Lolly came from his ear. Edward searched for the sound, only to find that on his right, little Lolita was sitting there. Pretty a long and slender fishing rod is fixed on the railing in front of it, and it seems to have borrowed the principle of leverage. The one on her side only needs to be pulled lightly to make the fishing rod stand up high. Fishing should not be too easy. Seeing this, Edward was surprised in his heart, then raised his head, looked around, and then noticed that he and others were fishing in this way. When did the English become so smart? I really can't see it. Edward sighed in his heart, then turned his head, only to see that the angry-eyed little Lolita was looking directly at him, as if annoyed why he didn't pay attention to him. Hey! Edward showed an apologetic smile. Mary, I'm a little tired. I'll lie down with Elizabeth for a while. You guys should keep your noise down, okay? As he said that, Edward turned his attention to the other 4 eyes, and the cute little Lolly suggested softly, Oh, I see. Little Lolita was a little disappointed when she heard that Edward couldn't play with her immediately. She remembered a betting agreement she had with the other 4 partners, and then she all grinned and cheered up. You and Elizabeth take a rest for a while. After a while, I will treat you two to eat the big fish I caught. As she said that, little Lolly used her tender arms to make a big fish shape with all her strength, with her small chest puffed out, her eyes facing forward, and she said proudly after finishing speaking, The other little lollies also nodded and agreed softly. Seeing this, Edward touched little Lolita's soft long red hair, and said dotingly, "Then, I'll just wait for Mary's big fish, don't we just wait?" As he spoke, Edward turned around, looked at Princess Elizabeth who was lying down, and asked her to talk to her, and his eyes immediately fixed. It turned out that in the warm wind, Her Majesty the Princess had closed her eyes unconsciously. Her chest was rising and falling with her breathing, and she had entered a sleep state. Edward glanced at it, swallowed quietly, then turned around, and beckoned to Lucy who was standing 5 or 6 feet away. "Your Majesty?" Lucy asked with quick steps and shortness of breath. "Take care of Mary and the others, don't let them play too crazy," Edward ordered earnestly, and Lucy also listened earnestly, although it was all nonsense of course. "Queen Mary." Edward looked for Queen Mary again, and saw her staring closely at the Thames, as if in a daze, not moving at all. "Forget it, you can handle it yourself. Safety first, I'll sleep for a while." Edward simply ended his speech, lay down, covered his stomach with a blanket, closed his eyes, and fell asleep with the warm wind blowing. This feeling made Edward feel lazy. His bones were sore and numb, his body didn't have any desire to move, and he didn't even want to open his eyelids. However, there was a loud noise in his ear, which made him wake up if he wanted to continue to sleep. Yawning, Edward slowly opened his eyes, and the scene in front of him was a little blurry. There's a light yellow halo around a pretty figure in front of her, and her long black hair hangs down her back. "She looks like a pretty girl," a word sounded silently in Edward's heart. I closed my eyes again and opened them again, only to realize that it was my sister Elizabeth surrounding a big fish, looking at it with relish, tisk tisk in her mouth non-stop, and sighed a lot. In the hands of the guards, he was holding a big fish about 1 foot long, and firmly fixed the still-moving big fish, preventing it from escaping. And the sharp-eyed little Lolita saw Edward's eyes gradually opening, and like offering a treasure, she pulled the guard over and presented the big fish directly in front of Edward, who was still a little sleepy. "Edward, look, this is a big fish I caught, and I caught it alone." With an arrogant tone, little Lolly raised her chin, with an expression that asked you to come and praise me. Edward, who was a little confused, was taken aback by the big fish in front of him, and after hearing what little Lolita said, he slowed down and patted his chest. "Mary is really good. I think you are the best." After Edward regained his composure, he patted the little Lolita on the head, and quickly praised her. Who knew that after hearing Edward's words, little Lolita wrinkled her face, showing a dissatisfied expression. "I'm not the strongest is Lennox." Upon hearing Lennox, Edward thought about it carefully, and finally realized that it was the surname of the light red-haired Mary whom he had saved last time. After adding a surname, it is much easier to distinguish. Edward sighed in his heart, and then turned his gaze to the little red-haired Lolly who had a big fish beside him. The little girl is the same age as little Lolita, but she looks a little shorter than little Lolita in height. She is extraordinarily petite and exquisite. I saw her hesitantly walking over slowly with a big fish about 1.5 feet long in her hands. She looked at Edward from time to time, and shrank back shyly after being noticed. "Your Majesty, this," the light red Lolly approached Edward. Facing everyone's eyes, her face was covered with the morning glow, and her face was bright red. After dawdling for nearly a minute, she seemed to know that she was wasting everyone's time. She suppressed the shame in her heart and said softly, "Your Majesty, this is a fish I caught myself. In order to thank you for saving me last time, I decided to give you this fish as a gift. Please forgive my rude behavior." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 257, Female Secretary. Oh, this is a very big gift. I have never seen such a big fish. Edward glanced sideways, and said in a surprised tone, looking extremely happy. Seeing His Majesty's satisfied smile, Mary Lennox's cheeks were flushed with a delicate smile, and her small eyes were narrowed into a slit, like a crescent moon. "Beautiful and innocent, Your Majesty, as long as you are satisfied." She lowered her neck. The red-haired girl was very shy. She lowered her head, not daring to look at the smiling young King Mary. "Let's grill fish together. This must be delicious." Edward looked at it from the corner of his eye, and the little Lolly on the side pursed her mouth and puffed up her face, looking like I was very angry regarding this. He turned his head, bent slightly, and said kindly to the angry little Lolita, "Come on, let's roast together." Edward picked up the jumping big fish, held it firmly with both hands, ignored the fishy smell, and acted like a king himself. Elizabeth, come too. Seeing the big black fish he didn't recognize in his hand, Edward cast his eyes on Elizabeth, who was standing there, and asked, "Wait a while." Elizabeth said coldly without turning her head, "Wait until I catch a big fish, okay? Let's wait for a while. I'll catch a big fish too, so you can see it." Edward looked around at the five Marys, and then said softly with a smile, "Oh yeah." The little Lawless immediately jumped up and down, chirping non-stop, and even a little eager to try, as if they wanted to compete with him, and winning the king was indeed a heart-pounding match. Afterwards, Edward sat in the central position, his gaze focused on the gentle water. Without saying a word in order to come up, the little Lawless held their breaths and concentrated, for fear of disturbing His Majesty's activities. Their gazes were the same as his, staring closely at the water surface. Their small eyes were round and their pouty faces were extremely cute. Edward was surrounded by everyone. His soft body leaned carefully on his solid back, and surrounded by five, it felt great. On the other hand, Queen Mary was chatting with a mate on her own, using this new style fishing rod, and didn't seem to pay any attention to this side. "Bah, bah, bah. Why do you look so evil? The mind is as calm as water, the mind is as calm as water. Namo Guan Shidayan Bodhisattva, Namo Tathagata Buddha." Edward fished calmly, thinking insincerely at this time. Our Majesty the King of England enjoys a leisurely and pleasant holiday, and forgets about those political affairs, but the ministers in London have to be busy and exhausted physically and mentally. If there is one word to describe it, they feel their bodies are hollowed out. Of course, Ferrus Alexander, the chairman of the Privy Council, did not know this sentence, but the general meaning is still clear. Even in his own office, Ferrus was still full of elegance in his manner and speech, as if barbarism and rudeness were separated from him. With his bald head bared, Ferrus frowned, and sometimes stopped to think about it, and he never stopped when something happened during the day. He is not processing various documents in the office, or meeting and discussing with various people. In short, he is non-stop and cannot take a breath. After writing the last letter, Ferrus shook his sore wrist, took a while, and let out a soft breath. Whoosh! The densely packed documents that had just been corrected were taken away by the secretary standing beside him, and the documents in front of him became blank again. Seeing this, Ferrus sighed softly. "Laura, who am I going to see again today?" Listening to Ferrus' tired tone, the young and beautiful secretary covered her mouth and sniggered softly. "Your Excellency Speaker, this is your schedule for today. Please take a look." As she spoke, the female secretary stretched out her white and tender arms, and placed a form filled with densely packed names in front of him. Ferrus glanced at it, then softened his eyes, looking distressed. Originally, in England, all secretaries were basically held by men, which was originally a position equivalent to an assistant. The general children of nobles started as secretaries, with a high starting point and easy promotion. This is incomparable to ordinary people, and it can be regarded as a privilege of nobles. And under the leadership of His Majesty the King, everyone suddenly discovered overnight that the secretary who often stays by their side turned out to be a female secretary. If you have something to do as a secretary, if you have nothing to do as a secretary, suddenly, overnight, a female secretary was added to it. While the government officials don't ask her to do anything, fetch some water, take some documents, even if it's placed there as a beautiful vase, it's good to look good. Of course, no one dared to do some mediocre things in this workplace, and it would be a devastating blow to the reputation if it was spread out in this regard. Edward originally wanted to suppress this trend, but he remembered that he had initiated it. It is not a good way to only allow state officials to set fires, but not to allow people to light lamps. Therefore, under the indulgence of His Majesty the King, female secretaries became popular in the London city government. This is very distressing, my dear Laura. And this king of mine is a distressing one. Ferrus stroked his forehead with a speechless look on his face, but he enjoyed this busy and fulfilling life. This is the distress and happiness of politicians. Look, Marcus William sent a letter yesterday, all kinds of difficulties, full of bitterness, endless. In short, one word, money. This is a letter from gentlemen from Southamptonshire, Worcestershire, Herefordshire, and Yorkshire. They are all expressing their greetings to His Majesty the King, but the hidden meaning is conveying their respect for the circuit court. Dissatisfaction with action. With thinning hair on his head, Ferrus kept pouring bitter water on the female secretary, talking about some important national affairs, without caring about her secretary's identity at all. The female secretary in her 20s showed no sympathy at all when she heard the speaker's words. Instead, she laughed happily, and her bright eyes turned into crescent moons, shining dazzlingly. "My father, no, Your Excellency the Speaker, this is your own choice. No matter how hard you work, You must persevere." As she spoke, she bent over, covered her mouth, and gloated besides, "His Majesty the King will not let you go. As the chairman of the Privy Council, this is your responsibility." Hearing his daughter's words, Ferris shook his head with a wry smile. "My daughter was just widowed last year. At the age of 20, her deceased husband had a strong family background and a strong dowry. She was sought after by extremely young nobles in England, but she dismissed it. It has been almost 2 years and she is not ready to remarry. Period." Chapter 258. Laura. In other words, in Europe, the most sought-after marriage partner by noble children is neither a young and beautiful unmarried noble lady, nor a wealthy daughter of a rich family. Aristocrats, they basically do not lack money and power. Although the food and drink are not as good as China at this time, compared with ordinary people, they are one heaven and one underground. Once people have no worries about life, they worry about their own family inheritance and future heirs are what they are. After the advent of the age of discovery brought fortune and misfortune. Although it brought a lot of wealth to Western Europeans, it accelerated the spread of diseases, and various life-threatening diseases bloomed all over Europe. Therefore, in this era, it is a matter of life and death for a woman to give birth to a child. Either died of dystocia, or died of various postpartum diseases such as bedding fever. The mortality rate was extremely high. Therefore, the surviving widows, and widows with a child, are very likely to continue to give birth to offspring, at least higher than those young noble ladies. Moreover, most widows will inherit the wealth of their ex-husbands. Therefore, marrying a widow will not only get one person, but also a lot of wealth, killing two birds with one stone. Therefore, after learning that Miss Laura Alexander was widowed with her child, most of the aristocratic children in London, and even England, buzzed around Laura like bees for them. The widowed Miss Laura Alexander is definitely a blue-chip stock. She not only has long light blue hair, a plump figure, and a straight nose, but also has fair skin and beautiful skin, with a protruding figure, like a ripe peach. The only flaw in the ointment is that she is about 5 and 2 feet, 1.7 meters, tall, much taller than most nobles in this era. This small shortcoming is not a problem. What's more important is that her father is Ferris Alexander, who has been trusted by 2 generations of kings. He is currently the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Privy Council. His power can be said to be hotter than those of the great nobles. Marry her, you will have a future and wealth, and you will be a winner in life directly, and it is not an exaggeration to say that you will reach the sky in one fell swoop. Therefore, for more than a year, all kinds of noble children gathered like bees seeing flowers, disturbing her restlessness for his daughter who asked for help. Ferris also had some headaches. In desperation, he took her to the office and used her clever mind to become his own exclusive secretary to handle documents and record appointments for him. Laura, it's been almost 2 years. Aren't you going to remarry? Looking at the beautiful daughter, Ferris thought of her marriage, and he had an idea in his heart, and tried to persuade him to repeat the words many times. Father, you don't need to worry about this matter, I'm free to measure, you'd better deal with this pile of documents properly. Laura blinked her bright eyes, covered her ears, shook her head in a funny way, and directly refused. But, I only have one daughter, you are, okay, honorable speaker, your daughter doesn't need to worry about you now, England's affairs are the most important thing. As soon as Laura heard this, she immediately interrupted and changed the subject. Look, His Majesty the King asked you to make a decree to encourage shipbuilding, so that England's ship level can develop rapidly, and this article is asking the Privy Council to regulate the food prices in England so that they can return to the normal level. 3 years ago, Laura tore a few documents from her hand, and a crisp voice suddenly rang out in the office. Hearing these decrees from the king, Ferris frowned more deeply. The wrinkles on his face were folded like waves, and a few silver hairs on his head could still be vaguely seen. Seeing this, Laura slowly stopped reading aloud, rubbed his shoulders lightly, and loosened his muscles and bones. Okay, Laura, you go out, I will handle it by myself. Ferris cheered up, twisted his neck, and said to his beautiful daughter, okay, I'm going out first, you take it slowly. This is also your obligation as the chairman of the Privy Council. Goodbye, my dear father. Laura stepped out of the threshold with long legs. Before leaving, she lightly parted her red lips and said mischievously to Ferris, Alice, facing such a daughter. Ferris could only let out a sigh of relief. In the office, the sound of sizzling writing sounded again, and Ferris started working again. Workaholic. Laura waved her long legs and walked step by step to the front desk of the Privy Council Speaker's office, where she sat in her own small office just as he put his hips close to the seat carved with patterns. At this moment, A young secretary in his 20s quietly walked over with a cup of tea that was currently popular in the upper class. "Laura, are you thirsty? Come, here's the tea I brought from home, try it." A cup of fragrant and steaming porcelain teacup was placed in front of Laura, which made Laura involuntarily take a breath, immediately refreshed, with a blush on her face. "No, Devereux, I'm not thirsty, and besides, I'm going home, drink it yourself." Laura straightened her expression, put on a show, cleaned up a few things on the desk, and directly refused. "Here, all right. Go back and rest first." Devereux looked a little embarrassed, neither standing nor sitting, and finally choked out a sentence. His face was slightly rosy. Then he stomped his feet lightly, turned and left. Laura glanced at him, then lowered her head and tidied up seriously, and the other male secretaries who were about to show their attention, who were eager to try, suddenly calmed down. Their faces became gloomy, and they turned to do their own things. Dong dong dong. There was a sound in the office, and no one wanted to stop her, nor did they dare to stop her standing up. Laura twisted her slender waist, picked up a light small bag, and then walked to the door, dismissing the people who were peeking aside, and left directly in front of the Palace of Westminster. The carriage belonging to the Alexander family was parked. The groom sat on the eaves of the carriage, watching his young lady approaching, and hurriedly removed a small stool. "Miss." The groom nodded honestly. Laura nodded slightly, and then got into the carriage with her support for those suitors. Laura is very clear about their thoughts. The first time she was blind, she found a short-lived ghost. She must be careful this time thinking about it. She thought of her 1.5-year-old daughter, who couldn't help showing a loving face. The combination of maternal brilliance and beautiful face can fascinate people. Chapter 259, The King and Number 039's Gift. As for the matter between the secretaries, Ferris didn't know. Even if he knew, he would take a default attitude. Those who can become his secretary must either have outstanding skills or have a strong background. Anyway, they are not ordinary people, but they can also be a good son-in-law. At this time, Princess Mary, who is married to Spain, also completed her wedding on December 8, 1549. Since then, she has been the Spanish princess. Different than in history. In the original history, Mary was the queen, and Prince Philip was just a prince, and their status did not match. In order to make Philip's title equal to that of Mary, Charles V bestowed the thrones of Naples and Jerusalem to Philip. Princess Mary thus became Queen of Naples and titular Queen of Jerusalem. Of course, since Edward designated Port Francisco as the fief of Princess Mary, she also became Count Francisco. For this reason, Prince Philip was also canonized as the Earl of New Madrid, which just matched the status of Princess Mary after a sensational and extravagant wedding in a grand church. Princess Mary and Prince Philip were newlyweds, and it was like glue. Prince Philip is ambitious, and he is a bit hard to be paranoid about power. He looks ordinary, but he is much more majestic than ordinary nobles. Although he is not good at riding, he has a unique understanding of war in the army. Once a man has ambition, he will add a bit of color, exuding masculine brilliance, which is very attractive to women. Moreover, the same as Princess Mary, he is also a devout Catholic, and the two directly have a lot more common topics. Therefore, when Princess Mary saw the young and masculine Prince Philip, all eyes were on him, and she was extremely satisfied as far as Prince Philip was concerned. When the beautifully dressed Princess Mary came down, his eyes also focused on his wife. Although Princess Mary is a bit older, her well-maintained smooth face, surging breasts, and plump body, coupled with the charm of a mature woman, are comparable to those of his lovers in this regard. Prince Philip also nodded in satisfaction. This princess who is about to become his wife, compared with princesses from other countries, has fair skin and a natural fragrance on her body instead of wearing layers of perfume. Compared with her previous fantasy, she is so much better. He was prepared to think that this old princess of England must be ugly and old, otherwise why would she not be able to marry? Who knew it was such a surprise, far exceeding my expectations. Therefore, since they got married for a month, like all newlyweds, the two of them are like glue. They look at each other when they walk, and they look very affectionate. When King Charles V of Spain saw such a beautiful appearance of his cousin, there was a trace of remorse in his heart. Politics. Even if they knew about it at the time, the chances of the two combining are very small. Moreover, the Spanish court is quite satisfied with this Her Royal Highness Princess from England, not only because of her generous dowry, but also because she is a generous princess. She did not hesitate to reward the servants who fulfilled her orders. In just 1 month, she rewarded thousands of gold coins, thus gaining the favor of most people in the court. So, when John Carroll saw this Her Royal Highness, no, it was Her Royal Highness, Her Royal Highness was radiant, and her whole person exuded a happy mood, and she became more and more beautiful and attractive. His Royal Highness, may the Lord bless you. John Carroll turned his eyes, and bowed his head to her Royal Highness, who was wearing a fluffy dress and sitting on a chair. Princess Mary hummed lightly, turned her eyes to the short, fat and hairy businessman in front of her, and asked in a lazy voice with her red lips slightly parted, "How is the task Edward gave you, hey? Your Highness, thanks to your help, we were able to send the fleet to Naples, Venice, and the Ottoman Empire in just 3 months. I have already completed the task of His Majesty the King. These are mainly yours." That's all credit. A large number of merchant ships were crowded in the team accompanying Princess Mary's marriage, among which the royal family's caravan accounted for the majority, and the leader was this John Carroll. His task was not only to open up the Spanish market, but also to sail into the Mediterranean Sea, laying a foundation for England's products to enter the Mediterranean region in the future, communicate with the Ottoman Empire, which has always been known for its barbaric face, and sell England's products. By the way, it can be said that his task is very important, and it is part of His Majesty the King of England's majestic layout, which cannot be missed. As he said that, John Carroll showed a flattering smile, raised his head slightly, looked up at the bright Princess Mary, and said flatteringly, "I haven't done anything. All of this depends on your own efforts." Princess Mary shook her head with a smile, and said indifferently that she no longer needs these credits. And her current status is just the concubine of Prince Philip of Spain. Moreover, she doesn't need to intervene in England's affairs in the future, unless her younger brother requests. Otherwise, it is a taboo. Okay, let's go down. I think Edward can't wait to hear from you. Princess Mary withdrew her scattered thoughts, sorted out her thoughts, and said softly, "Yes, Your Highness." John Carroll nodded, but his footsteps did not move. "What's wrong? Is there anything else, Your Highness? His Majesty the King asked me to give you some gifts, please accept them." As he said that, John Carroll clapped his hands, and 2 people came in carrying a wooden box outside the door, which looked heavy. Princess Mary glanced at the ordinary box for a while, feeling puzzled in her heart, but she had a calm expression on her face. "I know, you go down first. Finally, take 2 letters back for me, be careful, don't destroy them." Princess Mary made a gesture with her eyes, and the pretty maid at the side quickly took out 2 letters with glittering gold powder from the room, and handed them to John Carroll. Originally, Princess Mary planned to send someone to send it there in person, but John Carroll is so kind, she doesn't mind giving him some benefits. "Your Highness, I will leave then, please take care." A gleam of joy appeared on John Carroll's face, and then he backed away slowly, turned and left. Princess Mary glanced at it, and the personal maid at the side naturally ordered the maid to close the door, and then slowly opened the wooden box. Immediately, Princess Mary's eyes flashed, and glittering gold coins and jewels slowly piled up, conservatively estimated to be worth more than £10,000. Seeing this rare scene, even Princess Mary lost her mind at this moment, and soon, the princess quality cultivated over the years pulled her back. "Weena, put these away, you guys don't talk nonsense, understand?" Princess Mary's eyes were fixed, and she ordered sharply to the maids in the room. "Yes, Your Highness." Several maids nodded and responded softly. "Wealth touches people's hearts. In this Spanish court, she is a stranger, and there is no room for her to be careless." Then, she cast her gaze out of the window, whispering softly, "Edward." Chapter 260, Francisco of Uncertain Ownership. England is in constant turmoil, and it is located on French territory, which looks a little dangerous at present. England's territory in France, apart from the Normandy Islands, is only Boulogne and Calais, and of course, the newly occupied Port Francisco. Regarding the English's occupation of Port Francisco, a rich and oily seaport, King Henry VIII of France could not help being annoyed by the English, and even the corners of his mouth were blistered. Just last September, Henry VIII borrowed heavily and recruited a large number of mercenaries from Germany and Switzerland, with a total strength of 10,000. Under his personal leadership, the mighty French army gathered outside Port Francisco and stormed the city wall. In Europe, the richer the city, the stronger the city's defense system. If there is enough food stored, and if the defenders are strong, defending for half a year is like playing, and it just so happens that the city of Francisco is like this. If it is not a port city and the defenders lose their courage, the British army would not be so easy to occupy the first port city on the west coast of France and the second port city in France. Henry VIII had a deep understanding of this. Without his own navy, he lost command of the sea, and the French army launched continuous attacks on Port Francisco. However, Without the powerful artillery of later generations, the current bombardment is nothing more than a tickle for the strong city of Francisco, killing a few unlucky people at most. Boom! The roar of artillery rang out outside the city of Francisco. Immediately afterwards, the city wall clearly felt the impact, and several small pits were sunken on the surface of the city wall. If someone looked carefully, there were densely packed potholes on the city wall of Francisco, like pockmarks on a human face, and those with trypophobia would probably go crazy. Your Majesty, the shelling is over. A well-dressed nobleman bent over, put away the binoculars in his hand, and said respectfully to Henry II, who was sitting behind him on a chair decorated with beautiful patterns. Oh. Got it, how's the situation? Henry II opened his sleepy eyes and asked softly. It's still the same, the city wall is intact. The nobleman bent over and whispered in Henry II's ear. Well, I know. Henry II's expression was indifferent, as if he was used to it. Go down first. Yes, Your Majesty. The nobleman quickly left the tent as if he had been pardoned, for fear that Henry II would change his mind. Just as he left the tent, the king's roar and the sound of things being smashed came from inside the tent. He couldn't help shrinking his neck, and his eyes were full of joy. Henry II's temper is well known throughout France, ranging from local nobles to small city residents, and the king's violent temper is spread everywhere. In particular, in the past month, the time spent besieging the city of Francisco has become longer and longer, and the results achieved have become smaller and smaller. After each bombardment, His Majesty the King will lose his temper, even if it is a nobleman. If you are not careful, you will be scolded bloody. As for why the siege attack was not carried out, the main reason was that the casualties were too great. The mercenaries stopped coming forward after being fooled a few times in the face of this obviously death-threatening behavior. Of course, money is not as important as life. Seeing this, 2 months later, Henry II directly disbanded half of the mercenaries, leaving only 5,000 German mercenaries with relatively strong combat effectiveness, and Swiss mercenaries who were determined and fearless. At this time, in the city of Francisco, Major Charles was stationed, but he was sitting relaxedly on a chair covered with blankets. He didn't hear the sound of shelling coming from his ears, and he still calmly drank the bubbling green tea. I kept babbling a few times. Sure enough, this tea tastes pretty good. I don't understand why you don't like it. What a waste. Tisk tisk. You nobles, it's really incomprehensible. Major Charles glanced at the old and comfortable Major James, and expressed infinite emotion. I don't know why, since he drank the tea that the king took the late in, he fell in love with this bittersweet drink, and this is so consistent with his life experience and deeds. Born as a commoner, he started as an ordinary sailor at the age of 15 and survived for nearly 10 years. After rescuing a nobleman, he began to rise to the top. Finally, at the age of 35, he became the captain of a ship. Become the backbone of the English Navy. It can be said that, apart from the Secretary of the Navy and the Naval Affairs Committee, as well as several associate ministers, he and Major James are almost the future leaders of the Navy. However, Major James shook his head dismissively. For a nobleman like him, who had a golden key in his mouth since he was a child, the sweet taste like honey is his favorite. He only drank a few sips of this beverage called tea when he was having dinner with the nobles in London, and stayed away from it at other times. Charles, His Majesty the King sent me to ask, how long can you hold on to the city of Francisco? James pouted at Major Charles' pretentious words and asked directly. Of course. Major Charles said with a smug smile, and turned his eyes to the outside of the city with a hint of disdain in his eyes. As long as you send more soldiers and food, it doesn't matter how long you stay. Major James nodded when he heard the words, and agreed with Major Charles' words. There was no shortage of people and supplies. With a fortified city, it was indeed difficult for the French to capture. Mr. Major, I bring you bad news. His Majesty the King has decided to abandon the city of Francisco. James looked at Major Charles with a hint of worry in his eyes, and said softly, I know, I will be ready to evacuate. Who knew that Charles accepted the news directly and calmly, which surprised James. You know, Charles has been on guard for 3 months, and he suddenly said that he wanted to evacuate. It would be a little uncomfortable for everyone, but he looked indifferent. But Major Charles already knew the current predicament. Although it seems that the city of Francisco is impenetrable, the number of casualties has reached more than 1,000 in the past 3 months, and the number of reinforcements has become less and less. Moreover, the news of the chaos in England has also reached his ears. I knew this day was not far away. The most important thing is that England will not do bad business after occupying the city of Francisco for 3 months. Not only did they not receive any taxes, but they also had to send troops to maintain order and deliver enough food to keep the whole city alive. Moreover, The undercurrent in the city of Francisco is surging, and most of the troops have to maintain order in the city. Let's put it this way. Occupying the city of Francisco is not worth the loss. A port city without trade is an abandoned city. Seeing this city that is doomed to be lost, of course, wants to maximize its benefits. Then, don't you know, Monsieur Baron, that this beautiful city will eventually fall into the hands of the Spaniards? Major Charles blinked his eyes. Staying here, his news was blocked, and he was not clear about this major event currently. The Spaniards are still hesitant to take over the city. They feel a little reluctant about this dowry. Major James thought about it, and then expressed his understanding. I think it will go back to the French in the end. Chapter 261. The King. Your Majesty. The old and skinny Prime Minister bowed to Charles V, reclining on a luxurious seat, and asked with a stiff body, "N." Charles I opened his eyelids, and made a sound to the palace minister beside him, which was a little bit of face for him. The ambitious King Charles V of Spain no longer had the ambition of his youth. King Henry VIII of England, King Francois I of France, these romantic figures who once competed with him for the hegemony of Europa, have already passed away at this time, leaving him alone and lonely. As he was old, he could not have the same ambition as before, trying to conquer the whole of Europa and re-establish the Holy Roman Empire that belonged exclusively to the Habsburg family. In his old age, he put away his sharp minions, as if he had changed from a fierce tiger fighting for the hegemony of Europa to a docile old cat living at home. Harmless, however, the old palace minister knew that the old king's control over Spain had always been tight inside and loose outside. Any noble who dared to offend His Majesty would never exist the next day. Even the Pope of Rome, Julius III, is in his hands, and his every move depends on his eyes. Therefore, Mr. Gong Chancellor seemed to have not seen Charles V's immodest behavior that did not conform to noble etiquette, or in other words, he was used to it. Your Majesty, why did you reject England's proposal regarding Porto Francisco? The English savages wouldn't be so kind. Seeing his palace minister talking about the English, Charles V turned around and changed to a more comfortable movement. He shook his head and said dismissively, "Obviously, he has always held an attitude of contempt for the English." The attitude of Charles V basically represents most of the attitudes of Western Europeans. The English have always been branded with traces of barbarism, and contempt are the mainstream, and the English despise the Scots, ring after ring, which is inherent in human badness. The English are the most untrustworthy. They are only a little better than the French. As he said that, he couldn't help thinking of his lifelong opponent, King Francois I of France, a shameless person who had deceived himself several times. Thinking about it now, he was still a little angry, but this is the second largest port of the French. If it is lost, France's power will be reduced by at least one layer. Hearing the words, the palace minister lowered his head and was no longer ready to argue. Just as he was about to propose to leave, at this moment, an excited young man spoke from the side. "Philip, why are you so abrupt?" Hearing this voice, Charles V turned his head to see that his heir, Prince Philip, was walking in, and the guards outside the door looked helpless. "Father, your Majesty." Prince Philip bowed to Charles V and the old Prime Minister, then lowered his head slightly, and said to his father, "Father, this is a good opportunity, even if it is a piece of cheese with hidden traps, but with the strength of our Spanish phalanx, we can eat it without any scruples, not afraid of any traps." Prince Philip explained softly. The confidence on his face was revealed without any scruples, and an aura of contempt spewed out, full of awe for his ambitious son. Charles V was extremely satisfied, especially this attitude of contempt for all living beings, which was very similar to when he was young. But war is not a child's play, especially this war involving France, even with Spain's huge physique. It is a bit overwhelming. Seeing this, he couldn't help but want to use this incident to beat the young heir. "Philip, you must know that if we swallow this tempting fruit, what awaits us is not a trap, but a mad lion." With the help of his maid, Charles V sat up straight, facing his son, and said solemnly, "So, when we're exhausted from fighting that mad lion, who will profit the most?" Prince Philip listened carefully to his father's church, with a hint of thought and doubt in his eyes. "England." Prince Philip said uncertainly, "Yes, that's right, my son." What Philip did not expect was that what he guessed and was uncertain turned out to be true. Charles V nodded, telling him the truth without a doubt. "The English are a poisonous snake waiting for an opportunity. When we and the French are exhausted, it will bite us hard. This is indisputable, so, wisely, keep your distance from France." As he spoke, Charles V sighed with a hint of fatigue. Besides, the fat piece of Portugal is still on the sidelines. The French are not in a hurry. Philip and Gong glanced at each other, and they both sighed softly. His Majesty the King said that there is no hurry, so how dare the two of them go against it? Portugal can eat this piece of fat at any time, but the opportunity to take a bite towards France is very rare. Seeing Charles V with a tired face, the two left the room consciously at this time. The distraught King Henry II of France received a nobleman from England, Baron James, in his main tent. Good day, Your Majesty the King of France. Major James, wearing a dignified aristocratic uniform, gave a knightly salute to Henry II, who had a bad face. Dear Mr. Baron, are you here to deliver the instrument of surrender? As soon as Henry II's words came out, there was a burst of laughter in the tent, which was particularly harsh to Major James' ears. Your Majesty, on the contrary, I'm here to deliver the letter of persuasion. Major James did not show the angry expression that Henry II and others expected, but looked very indifferent, bold, presumptuous, extremely rude. A group of ministers showed angry looks one after another, and they couldn't wait to reprimand. All kinds of remarks flew together. Ahem. Be quiet. The old Duke of Guise looked at Major James with blazing eyes, and then yelled loudly, Mr. Baron, tell me why you are here. We don't have that much patience to spend with you. Faced with the scolding of the king's important minister, the Duke of Guise, all the nobles were silent one after another, but showed a calm look and didn't care for what is in our minds. We don't know, since His Excellency the Duke said so, then I will say it straight. Major James glanced at the mighty Duke of Guise, then bowed to Henry II and said in detail. Chapter 262 Migration. Hey, Suanna, hurry up. Time is running out. A noble lady about 25 years old, with a black shawl on her head and a beautifully patterned satin on her body, her delicate jade hands on her hips, with an anxious look on her face, shouted softly into the room. At first glance, she is the wife of a wealthy family. She has never done any work since she was a child, and she even speaks softly. Understood, Mom? An old nanny's tired voice came from the room, and it seemed that she was also a little impatient. Lena, hurry up, time is running out, we have to rush to Oxford together. On the other side, commanding the servants to carry the valuable and long-standing antiques in the house, they were cautious and focused on it, and suddenly they were shocked by the woman's cry. Understood, Ronaldo. The woman turned her head, and replied softly to her husband's urging. Her voice was delicate and weak. Brill frowned. He was non-committal about what his wife said, and nodded, counting it as knowing. He scratched his long black and greasy hair, and after the various items were transferred to the carriage by the manservant, he became more and more irritable, and there was a burst of evil fire in his heart. He looked at his freshly painted garden luxuriously and nostalgically, and his heart was full of reluctance regarding leaving his hometown. Ronaldo has never thought about it, nor has he ever hoped to leave the place where his family has lived for hundreds of years. This is his root in the center of their family's existence. Ahem. Ronaldo, what are you doing? Have you moved everything? Just as he was recalling the happy times when he was a child in his mind, a voice came from behind him, low and serious. Father, can't we think of a way again? No matter how much money we spend, we can't leave our hometown. Turning around, facing his father, Sir John, Ronaldo asked pleadingly, hoping that the pillar of the family could say something that would make him feel at ease. Ronaldo, it's impossible. The circuit judges will not risk offending His Majesty the King. Let us escape this disaster. Sir John shook his head with a wry smile. He also wanted to say something affirmative to his son's question, but the reality was so cruel. Ever since they were tried by Justice Marlowe Christopher in Oxford, the four major families have not only shed a lot of blood, but also had several pieces of fat cut off. More importantly, the four major families were asked to relocate to London forcibly, and today is the final deadline to leave for these squires. What they rely on to resist the central government and control Fangjin comes from the reputation and influence they have cultivated in the county for a long time. It can be said that once you leave the place where the family grew up, the prestige that has been cultivated for many years will begin to dissipate in just a few years. After 10 years, after the new generation grows up, the so-called family influence will no longer exist. As for the remaining offshoots, they will nibble away at the land left behind, become a family again, and then follow the old path to start cultivating their prestige so as to control the county where they are located. Sir John went over it again in his mind, and he would generally think of the scene after his family left Oxfordshire, and the land left behind was quickly swallowed up by side branches to nothing left as for the so-called law and ownership. After they left Oxfordshire, they completely lost their obligation to protect. Besides, with such a long distance, how could they take care of it all the time? Therefore, this wise old man directly sold the land belonging to the main branch in Oxfordshire to the remaining side branches. Rather than being gradually swallowed up, it is better to give up directly. Therefore, Except for one residence and a 1,000-acre manor, all the rest of Sir John were sold in this way. Not only can he have a huge amount of circulating funds when he goes to London, but also he can leave a trace of friendship with his side branch, and make some preparations for the future growth of the family. The other three families were puzzled by Sir John's approach. Even if a few pieces of meat were cut off by the king, each family still retains at least tens of thousands of acres of land, which is a lot of income. At least 3 floors down, a big loss facing the puzzlement of the others. After a few words of persuasion, Sir John stopped talking and began to prepare for the move silently. Soon, while Sir John was thinking, all the items had been completely transported to the carriage. Then, the carriage will bring the items to the Thames, and they will board the merchant ship like the other 3 families, and they will arrive in London in a day. Father, I'm fully ready. Ronald came to Sir John's side, hesitated for a moment, and then said softly, well. Sir John came back to his senses, with deep bags under his eyes, looked at his son's mournful face, and sighed. Let's go. All of this is God's arrangement, we cannot refuse. Looking nostalgically at the old house where he lived for generations, Sir John sighed heavily. His whole face seemed to be 10 years old, and he had lost his former vigor. With the help of his servants, Jazz managed to board this exquisitely carved carriage. Without saying a word, Ronald looked at his father's aging face, and couldn't help sighing, then looked back at his concerned wife, and said softly, let's go too. Time is running out. And some frail noble ladies, with beautiful eyes looking nostalgically at the place not far away, where they lived for 10 years, sighed softly, a little sad. Only then nodded heavily, and with the help of the maid, boarded another carriage. Gulu gulu, guru gulu. The wheels of the carriage walked on the uneven muddy ground, crushing the local grass without any scruples. More than a dozen large carriages, connected together and arranged in a long snake formation, slowly drove away from this nostalgic land. Along the way, there are no redundant proverbs. If you listen carefully, you can hear a few sobbing sounds. Even facing the rising sun, the scene still has a sense of sadness. After driving for nearly 4 hours, the carriage stopped, and Sir John woke up from his doze, and there were noises in his ears, even annoying. With the help of his servants, Sir John got out of the carriage, and what he saw were large cargo ships with a displacement of 500 tons, which completely blocked the spacious Thames River. Your Excellency, Your Excellency. As soon as he got off the carriage, a voice of greetings came over, and Sir John consciously showed a smile of coping. Chapter 263 Migration. Sir John forced a smile on his face, nodded to the few people who came to greet him, and remained motionless. Among the big families present, his age and prestige are the biggest among the big families, and only he can bear it. Your Excellency, you are finally here, we have been waiting for you for a long time. On the side, Sir Bergen Thomas with golden curly hair took a few steps, and the distance between Sir John and Sir John was getting closer. I saw a cautious and flattering expression on his face, and asked someone else what was on their minds. Our big families are in the same spirit, and we are going to London soon. I am not familiar with life, do you have any advice? With that said, Sir Thomas raised his head and looked at Sir John, who looked calm in front of him with hopeful eyes. The helmsmen of the other 2 families also raised their heads, and like Sir Thomas, their eyes focused on him expectantly. No wonder they are like this. Once they leave Oxford, they will take off their protective clothing and show themselves naked in front of the nobles and London dignitaries. If they go without preparation, they will be the fat on the table. At the mercy of others. Therefore, the other 3 families, who were full of worries, urgently needed a way to preserve their property. Therefore, the first thing that came to their minds was the figure of Sir John. The 3 of them had no other choice but to turn to Sir John for help. Seeing the patriarchs of the 3 major families plead so respectfully, Sir John felt a little comfort in his heart. The John family is still the head of the 4 major families, but this is far from enough. The crack at the corner of Sir John's mouth was getting wider and wider. Under the sun, the smile on his face was extraordinarily bright and mysterious. Silently thinking in his heart, such a position is not stable. After the other 3 families get over the difficulties, the position of the head of the John family will become history. In this period of crisis and opportunity, securing one's own family in a leadership position is the top priority in the eyes of Sir Thomas and others. This Sir John, who is famous for his wisdom, had a smile on his face that made them uneasy, and he felt a little flustered in his heart. However, when the family is overthrown, no matter how much profit is lost, there is still time to earn it back in the future. The 3 gritted their teeth in their hearts, and when they were about to accept Sir John's series of unequal treaties, Sir John finally spoke. Everyone, this is not the time to talk. Let's wait until we get on the boat. Sir John didn't say much, just glanced sideways at the nearby guards, and said mysteriously, "Yes, this is indeed not a good place." Sir Matthew knew that Sir John already had a plan in his mind when he heard that, and his nervous heart suddenly fell back, and he couldn't help but nodded in agreement. The others also understood Sir John's meaning, let go of their nervousness, and turned their eyes around. It is indeed inappropriate to discuss such an important matter in a large crowd, so they all nodded in agreement on the side. Ronaldo John saw his father surrounded by everyone, so he glanced at it, and then directed the servants to carry it to the boat that belonged to his family. The other three hugged around Sir John, and they greeted each other cordially with an indescribable sense of intimacy. The cold east wind blows slowly, with the chill of winter, greeting everyone cordially. Sir John and the others were about to board the ship. At this moment, there were bursts of weeping in the distance, much stronger than that of the four major families. Hearing the sound of crying, Sir John couldn't help but glance at the unpretentious carriages, dragging their families, walking towards the convoy. The crying of women and children was endless, and even became more and more intense direction, but the guards from the assize court turned a deaf ear to it, watching with expressionless faces, not moving at all. Seeing this, Sir John could not help frowning, and the crying and crying disturbed him. Sir Matthew, who was watching his words, saw him like this, immediately raised his head, and explained in a pitiful tone, "Your Excellency, these are the other 22 small families that will be judged with us. Although their goal is the same as ours, they are rushing to London, but their purpose is different from ours. We are London, but they are an island of Ireland full of barbarians." As soon as Sir Matthew finished speaking, several people, including Sir John, looked ugly, and they all felt the same way. It was not because their families were powerful that His Majesty the King did not dare to go too far with them. Otherwise, the same scene awaited them being relocated to Ireland. They were worried about being attacked by the barbarians all day long, and it was in a barren state, lacking everything. They would rather go to Scotland than to go to Ireland. With pitiful eyes, several people watched the group of sad people boarding the ship one after another, feeling inexplicably sad in their hearts. "Everyone, if we don't unite, the final result will be nothing more than that, and it will be even more unbearable." After being silent for a while, Sir John took this opportunity to explain to everyone the scene they were about to face, and planted a nail in everyone's hearts, so as to have an advantage for the next negotiation. Then, Sir John took a last look, led everyone to the room on the ship, and started an important discussion with several others on the other side. 22 small families whose destination was Ireland came to the banks of the Thames one after another, weeping, and boarded the ship to London, and then waited for London's arrangement to go to the northern part of Ireland controlled by England for a generation. Of course, Edward also knows that direct migration, if there is no benefit, anyone will have strong complaints. In order to dissipate the strong resentment in their hearts, His Majesty the King allowed the claim to be reduced by half, and also sold part of the Irish land belonging to the royal family to them at half the price of the land in England, so as to comfort their wounded hearts. That's why they walked onto the boat crying, instead of the army crushing them directly onto the boat. The difference between the two is huge. Of course, they are only the first batch of people, not the last batch. After more than 3 hours of deliberation, the four major families finally reached a consensus. First, the leadership of the John family was determined, note, established without infringing on the interests of other families. Afterwards, there was a series of marriages and exchange of interests, and the alliance of the four major families was established with interests as the link. Of course, because of the combination of interests, this alliance will definitely be dissolved because of interests. This is the result sooner or later. Sir John knew, too, that, unlike the others, he believed that coming to London, with its dangers, also came with its opportunities. If you lead this alliance, then the interests of the John family can be maximized. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 264, Migration Number. Your Majesty, Edward came to his office from the restaurant with a smile on his face, refreshed. The guard of the side hall wore a long bearskin cap, a red long-sleeved shirt on his upper body, and black trousers on his lower body. He stroked his chest with his right hand meticulously, and saluted Edward. His Majesty the King nodded as usual, and walked happily to his own office. At noon today, he ate a plate of beef using Chinese cooking techniques. Although the taste was not good compared to his previous life, Edward still rewarded the chef as an encouragement. This kind of progress is gratifying. One has to As long as it continues to be updated, sooner or later, the title of England's dark cooking kingdom will be removed sooner or later perhaps. This is also his biggest change to England. Edward silently let go of his thoughts, smiled and shook his head. If it came true, this would be the funniest thing. Walking to the living room of the office, a rigorous middle-aged man was already sitting on a beautifully patterned seat in a row, with a cold face facing forward, his eyes focused on a point in front of him, as if he was thinking about something. Edward focused his eyes on his face, looked carefully, and finally found the impression of this middle-aged man in his mind. Angus, the chief judge of the circuit court, is a rigorous and cautious person. Facing his questioning every sentence last time, he revealed a little clue, which can also be said to be a breakthrough point. Otherwise, Edward would have to spend a lot of searching across the country and spend a lot of time checking. Although he has such credit, Edward is dissatisfied with Angus's cautious and independent behavior. Therefore, when passing by Angus, although Angus quickly got up and bowed to salute, Edward just nodded with a smile and returned to his office without hesitation. Your Majesty. The plump girl's secretary greeted the young king sweetly. Edward's eyes stayed on the girl's light green dress for a few seconds, and the huge bulge stretched tight after bending over, and left a sentence, "Very good, today's clothes are pretty." After that, he went on to his office. Seeing this, the girl showed a gleam of joy on her face, and she bowed to watch the king enter the office. Then she got up and followed her into the office. The king glanced at the soft fur-covered seat, found the comfortable position, and reclined. He had just finished eating, which made him much more comfortable. The king's belly was rising and falling, thinking beautifully in his heart, showing an expression of enjoyment. After the girl came in, she stood behind him, bent down and lightly hammered the king's shoulder with her small hands, soothing his body. Edward narrowed his eyes, looking at the pair of wobbly big lanterns in front of him, with a look of enjoyment on his face. I don't know how it grew. It used to be hungry and full, but it can still grow so big. It turns out that it is still very talented. It seems that we need to cultivate it carefully in the future. Edward didn't bother the girl's massage. He just thought about it quietly and enjoyed it. After about 10 minutes, Edward felt that the girl's strength was a little weaker, and then Edward made a sound. "Stop. I'm going to start working too." As he said that, Edward got up quickly. He didn't know whether it was intentional or not. He bumped the girl's bump with his head, and the girl immediately let out an exclamation, and the huge chest, like jelly, swayed up and down, full of movement, which made people want to catch it. "Yes, Your Majesty." The girl's face was blushing. She made light contact with her eyes, and immediately lowered her head shyly, and after replying, she turned around and left quickly. Seeing this, Edward smiled softly, no longer cared about the shy girl, and sat up, looking at the appointment form on the table. The one in the first line was Angus, the chief judge of the circuit court. Soon, the door of the office was gently opened, revealing Angus' figure. After the usual greetings and salutes, the young king raised his head, stared at Angus, who looked stiff, and asked, "Speak up. Sir Adonis, come to see me today. What's the matter?" Hearing His Majesty the King's question in an unfamiliar tone, Angus knew that the king was somewhat dissatisfied with him. Although he understood why His Majesty the King was dissatisfied with him, Angus still did not intend to change anything. This was his rule of conduct and would not be easily changed. "Your Majesty." Angus sorted out his thoughts, faced His Majesty the King solemnly, and reported his content. According to our statistics, in the past 2 months, in the 39 counties of England, a total of 156 cases similar to the Oxfordshire case have been tried, and the offending families are 269. Based on the results of Judge Marlowe Christopher's trial, about 32 big families will be forcibly relocated to the London area, with a total of 565 people. Angus said a series of numbers, and his heart was a little turbulent. This is a huge number. He took a peek at the serious-looking His Majesty the King, calmed down, and continued. The number of families that will be relocated to Ireland has reached 237, with a total of 1,664 people. Tomorrow, the family from Oxford will arrive in London, waiting for your assignment. In 3 days, families from 5 counties will arrive, and in 10 days, Edward closed his eyes, listening to the series of numbers spit out from Angus's mouth, without any fluctuation in his heart. Compared with his squires and gentlemen with nearly 8,000 households and a population of 100,000, these families only occupy a small share. Far from letting the local forces reach the point where they are heard, it can even be said that the country is still controlled by the gentry group, just scratching the surface. But in the current situation, the young king is already satisfied. It not only deterred and weakened some local forces, but also allowed the declining royal authority to be re-established in the past 3 years. After all, if his actions go too far, the whole of England will be in turmoil. Compared with them, the current rights are just appetizers. He couldn't cut himself off from England's interest class, otherwise there would be no king, and there were many families related to the Tudor royal family, and they didn't mind changing one. Therefore, the young king was very measured, and only set the time within 3 years, and did not continue to extend it forward, otherwise it would be a shame. And the voice in his ear stopped, and then Edward opened his eyes and nodded in satisfaction. You need to have a careful trial of those circuit judges, and immediately question those who are corrupt and do not follow orders. Hearing His Majesty the King's stern tone, Angus could only bite the bullet and agree. This is an offending job. Chapter 265 Preparation. After accepting this task, Angus looked a little dignified. He actually refused the task sent by the king in his heart, but it was something His Majesty the King personally handed down. It was related to his future, so he couldn't refuse it easily. As for fooling around, he didn't have the guts either, and the recently popped up Special Operations Division and that huge blood blade were not vegetarian either. Angus quietly exited the king's office, and then walked away quickly with a sullen expression on his face, as if he had provoked some filth, and was eager to get out. And Emma, the secretary near the door, watched him leave suspiciously, and was surprised that he didn't have the usual polite greeting. And just when the girl was confused, she received a call from His Majesty the King. Seeing this, the girl resisted the doubts in her heart, opened the door gently, bowed her waist, and walked in. Your Majesty. The girl lowered her head slightly. Go and summon the Mayor of London, William Celsey. Edward looked at the lists full of names in front of him, and when he heard the sound of the door opening, he commanded the girl who had just entered without looking up. Yes, the girl readily agreed, then turned and left. At this time, Mayor William, who was embarking on another wave of London cleanup activities, heard the king's summons in his office. What did you say? His Majesty the King wants to receive me? Mayor William asked the young secretary, who came in with a puzzled face. His head was a little confused. Yes, Your Excellency, that's what the secretary from the court told me, and she also asked that you go right now. Facing the mayor's doubts, the young female secretary parted her red lips slightly, and with her legs together, she spoke unhurriedly. Oh, got it. Prepare the carriage immediately. I'm going to work. Mayor William moved with stiff neck, looked directly at his secretary, and ordered. Yes, Your Excellency. Upon hearing the mayor's order, the female secretary readily agreed, and then left the office to start preparations. Unlike other people who demanded a beautiful secretary, Mayor William demanded a swift, serious and responsible secretary, which is why the scene happened. There are no prevarications and doubts, only yes and no, simple and fast, easy and pleasant to do things. After tidying up his appearance, Mayor William took the recently popular notebook to prevent forgetting what His Majesty ordered, and then walked outside the city government building. At this time, a carriage was already waiting outside. He only needed to get on the carriage, and he could arrive at Whitehall Palace in less than 5 minutes soon. Under the guidance of the maid, he came to the luxurious office belonging to the King. Your Majesty, please forgive me for being late. Mayor William bowed down as soon as he entered, performed a knight salute, and said humbly, It's okay, Mr. Mayor, I won't wait long. Edward shook his head and said this was just a polite remark. Neither of them took it seriously. Mayor William bowed slightly, and stood aside respectfully, without any trace of disrespect. And although Edward didn't care about these things, he was still satisfied with his attitude. This is the attitude a subordinate should have. As for this cultivated talent, the king's expression was much more pleasant. In the past few days, migrating families from various counties in England are coming. As the Mayor of London, you must be prepared, register your household registration, collect information, and try not to make mistakes. Welcome these people from the place. Yes, Your Majesty. Mayor William nodded and said respectfully, London sold a lot of luxury residences a few days ago, and I've already started to make preparations. What is an engine? This is an engine. He thought of it by himself before he gave the order, and started to prepare. How much trouble it takes. Sure enough, he was worthy of being a minister in the Elizabethan era. It is not easy to leave a name. Looking at the mayor in front of him, Edward couldn't help feeling emotional. Now that you're ready, do it with your heart. Yes, Your Majesty. Mayor William agreed softly. Also, at the end of August, London will hold the second official selection examination. This time the scale will be expanded several times. You must cooperate with the Speaker of the Privy Council to make it go smoothly. Another thing suddenly occurred to Edward's mind. The second official selection examination was about to take place, unlike the first time when only the London city government and the central government were filled. The second time was to fill the 39 counties of England. The number of people needed was even larger, and at least expanded several times to barely meet the demand. Moreover, due to the successful holding of the first time, the scale of the number of participants this time must also be unprecedented. Therefore, it is far from enough to rely on the central government's auspices. It also needs to be assisted by the London city government once held to ensure smooth progress. I understand. Mayor William thought for a moment, and then agreed. There are still several months, and there is plenty of time. I will definitely assist Your Excellency the Speaker to ensure the smooth progress of the second official selection exam. Afterwards, Edward chatted with him about the recent changes in London, and by the way, discussed the implementation of various decrees in London and the improvement plan. In this way, more than an hour passed happily and easily. After Mayor William left, Edward stretched himself, lay down on a comfortable recliner, and took a rest for a while. After a while, he got up and was about to call Emma outside the door and ask her to pass on Fairess Alexander. Then he felt a little bored in the office again, and suddenly had a thought of going out for a walk later. The idea expanded infinitely, and he couldn't stand it anymore, so he decided to implement it himself. Of course, walking around is not for private interviews. Edward said that he is also afraid of death, and he is not brain dead. Therefore, the target of this small visit is the Palace of Westminster, which is the seat of the Parliament and the central government, where large-scale ceremonies and events are held. Emma, get ready, let's go out for a walk. Standing up, Edward walked out of the office directly, and said to the surprised girl, Your Majesty. But the girl hurriedly prepared to persuade her. Her face suddenly turned red. It's nothing to worry about. Don't have any bad thoughts. We just went to the Palace of Westminster to have a look, so that you can increase your knowledge. Edward stared carefully at the girl's face, saw that her cheeks flushed suddenly, and made a teasing joke before explaining. Oh, the girl didn't know whether she was disappointed or relieved. She said oh softly, and then started to prepare. Chapter 266. After victory. The decisive battle between the government army and the Catholic mob ended with the victory of the government army. Soldiers walked scatteredly on the blood-stained grass. Every time they took a step, the blood-soaked soil and weeds would form a blood-colored footprint, which was red and black, muddy and difficult to walk on. The entire wilderness was densely packed with corpses, and a large group of salivating waiters hovered in the sky. When the soldiers distanced themselves, they came down this time to carve delicious meat. A young warrior, wearing a thin set of leather armor, was broken and incomplete. Frowning, looking around holding a blood-colored dagger in his thick arm, he hurriedly stopped when he passed by a dead body that was still fully clothed. First, he raised his head and looked around, and when no one was paying attention, he squatted down silently, groping among the corpses with his hands, with expectations in his eyes, hoping to find something that belonged to him with his own hands. Well, in less than a minute, a disappointed expression appeared on his face, and an annoyance surged in his heart, giving him an urge to vent. But this is a battlefield. He is just a soldier. What right does he have? Thinking silently in his heart, his thick arms with bulging veins relaxed. Then, he lowered his head and swept towards the corpse's feet. Suddenly, his eyes jumped with joy, and he couldn't wait to move his face closer. This is a pair of leather boots. A pair of leather boots made of sheepskin. Its surface is covered by a layer of mud, but it still cannot hide the fact that it is leather boots. The man rubbed his eyes, and happily wiped off the mud on the shoe with the grass on the road, which was extremely precious. These are a pair of leather boots. Only those rich lords will wear them. Ordinary people will not own them. A pair of boots like that would probably cost a shilling. The man wrapped the leather boots with a piece of rags like a baby, and carefully put them into a big bag in his hand. The smile on his face could not be blocked as a summoned militia. The king's guards had already swept it before he swept it away, and the summoned militia, could only pick up the omissions after this big circle. The most valuable thing is only the pair of leather boots just now, and the rest are a few scattered pennies, and some scraps of short swords, which are not worth much. And with this surprise, the man became more interested in the dead body in front of him. A person who owns such a pair of leather boots is definitely not an ordinary person. Although there are not many pounds or anything, some other things must be worth a lot of money. Thinking about it, the man turned the dead body in front of him thoroughly, and as expected, he found many good things in this way. His lingerie was of thin silk, and he had a gold tooth in his mouth, which, if you add those leather boots, was a fortune. Just as he was cheering in place, the militiamen in other places did the same, with surprises on their faces. War is a struggle for wealth. Only the victor will have everything, and will plunder everything from the loser. Therefore, whenever the king recruits the militia, all parts of England will actively participate, for the moment of victory. At this moment, our commander-in-chief, Knight Alexander, with a handsome face and a solemn face, was sitting in the position that belonged exclusively to the commander-in-chief, listening carefully. Your Excellency, Commander, in this battle, the guards killed a total of 165 people and injured 332 people. Among them, 53 cavalrymen died and 38 people were injured. It is estimated that the guards have a total of 372 people died, and 150 people retired. The young clerk looked up at the expressionless Alexander Knight, then continued to bury his head, talking about the records in his hand. A total of 586 people were killed by militiamen from all over the country, and 1,860 people were injured. It is estimated that 836 people will die in the end. As for the situation of the enemy, there is no statistics yet. Okay, I see. You go and convey my order. Let the quartermasters take out the food and drinks that have been prepared, so that the soldiers can take a good rest. When Knight Alexander heard that the number of deaths had finally reached only one level of the total force, his frowning brows loosened slightly, and then he turned his head and gave instructions to the young clerk. Yes, Your Excellency. The clerk nodded and turned to leave. As for the seized materials and so on, they have not yet been calculated clearly. After all, there are still too few people who can read and count. After the young clerk went out, Knight Alexander seriously thought about his gains and losses in this battle. As for the Spanish phalanx, he still didn't fully understand how to use and command it, so he could only continue to explore. Cavalier Alexander was a little frustrated. In fact, he still knew a little about the Spanish phalanx. After all, he once fought with Henry VIII in France, and was fortunate to see a battle scene of the Allied Spain at that time, and the scene was very spectacular. But it's one thing to be on the sidelines, and quite another to direct it yourself. Knight Alexander has always been skeptical about the strength of the pikemen and their courage without sword soldiers and halberd soldiers. The possibility of pikemen holding their positions is pitifully low. Therefore, after seeking the consent of His Majesty the King, several captains of archers were kept in the military uniform, which could give him some confidence. As for musketeers, knights feel pretty good, but compared with longbows, their power and distance are still somewhat insufficient. However, its advantage is that it can be mass-produced and does not require long-term training. Your Excellency, the King's messenger is here. Just as Alexander entered the thinking mode, the guard outside the tent suddenly broke in, raised his head, and whispered, "Oh, invite him to come in." Cavalier Alexander hurriedly got up without thinking about his thoughts, and hurriedly said that His Majesty is the King's most important thing. Soon, a man with a dusty smell came in. His face was deeply exhausted, but he still straightened his back, looked at Knight Alexander with a straight face, and said, "Knight Alexander, I am here by order of His Majesty the King. Come, this is a letter from His Majesty the King." After performing a knight salute, he handed over a waxed letter to him, and immediately turned around and left without hesitation. Knight Alexander glanced at the departing messenger soldier, walked to his seat, began to disassemble it, and read it carefully. In less than 2 minutes, Knight Alexander had a general understanding of the letter from London. Except for some greetings, there was only one content: to support Marcus William. Chapter 267. Your Majesty, at present, Norwich's rebels have begun to approach Cambridgeshire. Not only have several manors been attacked, but countless villages have been burned, killed and looted. The county is completely immersed in panic. The group of devils from hell are extremely ruthless. The rich and nobles fled one after another, and the whole county is full of riots and unrest. Stupid poor people and workers are just about to move. We are afraid to leave your arms and no longer bathe in the glory of the Lord, and only you, the provident of God, the great monarch of England, Edward VI, can save the 80,000 citizens of Cambridgeshire. So, with the expectation of the whole Cambridgeshire, I beg you, great Lord, to save poor Cambridge." Edward sat quietly in his own chair, listening to the pretty girl in front of him, reading a letter from Cambridgeshire for help, fully interpreting the fear and nervousness of the person in front of Edward. It is pitiful to look at. Okay, don't read any more, it's still the same distress letter. Don't you know how to do it yourself? How can I have so many troops? Edward waved his hand irritably and stopped the girl from performing. He was very irritated by the current situation in eastern England. Cambridgeshire is adjacent to Norfolk. Obviously, those domineering gentlemen have panicked and jointly wrote a letter of appeal to London. Your Majesty, not only Cambridgeshire, but also Lincolnshire and Suffolk have sent requests for help. The girl looked at the frowning young king, and explained something softly. which made the king even more irritable. You asked the Privy Council to draft a letter in my tone, asking Marcus William to block the rebels in Norwich, and stop letting them wander around. For the current plan, the only way to do so is to siege the people, stabilize the hearts of the people, and then get the support of the Alexander Knights to wipe out this group of mobs. Edward thought hard in his heart that he couldn't stand these mobs any longer at this time. The Marquis of William, who was far away in Norfolk, once again gathered tens of thousands of militiamen in East England and other places. After learning the lessons from the past, he no longer underestimated the enemy and started to use tactics uncharacteristically, step by step. Then, in front of Robert Cade, the leader of the rebel army, a middle-aged man appeared. He was thin, well-dressed, and his hair was combed meticulously. Moreover, his every move is full of the stereotyped meaning of aristocrats, and he looks like a nobleman. His two eyebrows are a bit thick, which makes people laugh out of nowhere. In order to establish majesty, he has two thick beards on his lips, wears a black tall hat, and has a humble smile on his face. Have a standing umbrella as a jazz. Robert was satisfied with such a seemingly noble envoy, and did not feel disgusted with him. Sir, also to show respect to you, His Excellency the Marquis ordered the army not to attack Norwich within 3 days. I hope you can receive this gift. The envoy squinted his eyes and saluted, then raised his head and carefully observed the elderly rider in front of him, his eyes full of exploration. I saw an elderly man about 53 or 4 years old, wearing a black cloak, a worn black jacket with white on his upper body, tight trousers on his lower body, and a black wooden walking stick in his hand. Full of energy, a dagger was slung around his waist, and the sheath on the sword was unpretentious, looking like an ordinary person's saber. From the perspective of the envoy, the old rider was in control of the power, and his wrinkled face was full of awe-inspiring majesty, which made him murmur in his heart, Your Excellency the messenger, I don't know how much sincerity the Lord Marquis has brought, but don't let me down. Robert squinted his eyes and looked carefully at the messenger in front of him, with a hint of complacency and ridicule in his tone, full of interest. Not attacking for 3 days did allow them to breathe for a while, but it was not enough to impress Robert. The victory in the previous battle made his original appetite even bigger. This small discount does not have much meaning. The face of the middle-aged envoy remained motionless, as if he hadn't heard the meaning of the words, and continued to maintain his aristocratic demeanor. It seems that the rider meant that if the conditions brought did not satisfy him, nothing would be discussed regarding this. The middle-aged messenger slightly opened his lips, and said expressionlessly, Sir Robert, according to the usual practice, His Majesty the King is very intolerable to you people, but for the sake of the majority of Norfolk residents, His Majesty the Marquis tried hard to persuade His Majesty the King to allow negotiations with you. Hearing these words, Robert stood up instantly. With an excited look on his face and red eyes for Sir Robert and others, his goal from the beginning was not to defeat the king, but to use a powerful army to force His Majesty the King to negotiate, so as to obtain satisfactory conditions for himself and others. Originally a member of England's ruling class, Sir Robert understood that with the strength of himself and others, he was definitely no match for the king. Oh, yes, that's a real decision, my sir. Sir Robert came over, facing the envoy who seemed to be aristocrat, ready to give him a big hug to express his joy. No need, Mr. Jazz, I just hope that your next conditions will not be too excessive. When Robert arrived, the middle-aged man stepped back quickly, waved his hand, and said in denial, Okay, Mr. Messenger, please express my thanks to His Majesty the Marquis. He has done something beneficial to everyone in Nuofu. Robert looked at the somewhat disgusted messenger, smiled indifferently, and then said heartily, compared with this good news, what is this dislike? While sending people to negotiate, Marcus William sent people to spread troops around Norwich, preparing to cut off Norwich's connection with other places in one fell swoop. In this way, the growing rebel army can be reduced, and Norwich City, which does not produce food, can be cut off, making them face the plight of food shortage at this time. In order not to attract the attention of the rebels in Norwich City and play the role of boiling frogs in warm water, Marcus William sent his nephew to negotiate. The status of the nobility was even more deceptive, convincing the rebels that it was real. As for the authorization of the king, the permission to negotiate, etc., they were all made up by Marcus William himself, and they should not be taken seriously. After the victory, all these are just clouds. It turns out that the content can still be modified, so it was a false alarm. Sorry about the chapter name. Chapter 268. After a light winter rain, the garbage and dust piled up on the street became muddy, and the sky was as blue as washed. The blue sky made people feel cheerful then, The passers-by on the road suddenly noticed that there was a rare warmth rippling in the air, spreading from the heart to the whole body, and the coldness was swept away immediately. Looking up, a round of slightly warm sun was high in the sky. The entire city of Norwich was originally filled with joy, but it suddenly became more intense, and the whole city was filled with joy regardless of the muddy roads. People went to the streets one after another. The boys and girls sang and danced, as if they were celebrating a festival, and their joy was beyond words. Your Excellency, the news has spread to the entire city, and people are overjoyed and celebrating. Standing on the high top of the city, the original solid city wall did not show any trace of being destroyed. It can be seen that for Norwich City, being captured by the rebel army was a sudden event, and it was too late to resist, and the gray-haired Sir Robert was standing vigorously on the top of the city, wearing tight Chinese clothes, without the plain clothes he usually wore. He looked much younger. Beside him, an old man who was older than him, like Sir Robert, was dressed in high-grade linen clothes, about his waist, stared at the carnival crowd below with cloudy eyes, and slowly revealed a trace of smile. If you look carefully, you will find that this old man is about 5 or 6 levels similar to Sir Robert, and he is Sir Robert's brother, William Cade, and beside them, there were no other leaders of the rebel army. Only a tall and thin young man accompanied them, and the sentence just now was what he said. David, we have to believe that this joy is far from this. They will flow into the North Sea like the Wensum River. Sir Robert's eyes stayed on those happy faces for a moment, then he turned and said to the young man, "Yes, Your Excellency, that must be the case." The young man clenched his fists and said excitedly with a flash of determination on his face, "Robert, if what the Lord Marquis said is true, then we can indeed breathe a sigh of relief." William Cade, who was 60 years old, stroked his long gray beard, with a hint of relief in his eyes, turned his head, glanced at his younger brother lightly, and said, "I think the Marquis of Paul will not break his promise. After all, nobles value their reputation very much. Besides, it involves His Majesty the King. He has to be cautious." With a smile, Sir Robert patted his brother's shoulder lightly, and said in a relaxed tone, having been in contact with the upper-class nobles for a long time, Sir Robert understood very well that for the nobles, the honor of the family should not be filthy, and if he broke his promise, it would be no less than a fatal blow to the family's prestige. Therefore, not only Sir Robert, but also the rest of the leading class of the rebel army would not have the slightest doubt about this negotiation. However, Sir Robert and others would not know that in peacetime, nobles do value family honor in their lives, but in wartime, reputation does not exist in the face of the enemy. Therefore, when the city of Norwich was jubilant, the residents had no idea that their side had been surrounded under the sunshine. The small river flows uninterruptedly, jumping from time to time, and a shining drop of water pops out. It looks like a lively stream, and a group of more than 30 cavalrymen dismounted and stood. Some were sitting, some were stroking their mounts lightly, some scooped up a pot of brook water, drank it on their own, and clicked their mouths from time to time, just like the old days. Enjoy it to the fullest. In front of the team, a tall and burly knight raised his head and looked forward. His blue eyes were sometimes slightly closed and sometimes opened, but his ears moved from time to time, looking extremely serious. His tall nose, strong and powerful arms, and thick calloused hands make his identity stand out. Get on the horse, someone is coming. As the leader of the team, Bull not only possesses powerful force, but also his hearing is far superior to that of others. Generally, he has the most say in such matters. Hearing the captain's call, the 30 or so people immediately mounted their horses, moving quickly and neatly, as if they were one. Bull nodded with satisfaction. These are his folks. After being called together, they became a team. The legs were slightly exerted, and the horse under the buttocks immediately knew what he meant, and ran forward lightly with 4 strong hooves. The rest of the riders also clamped their legs tightly and followed him one by one. Pieces of broken grass were splashed under the horse's hooves. In less than 5 minutes, what appeared in front of everyone was a long caravan. The reason why it is said to be long is that in the caravan, carriages loaded with grain were moving slowly. On both sides of the caravan, more than a dozen people. The mercenaries were riding horses, talking and laughing, and the atmosphere seemed to be getting along well. But Bull smiled slightly in his heart. He just came to break the tranquility. The cavalry's vibrations startled the calm caravan. Everyone in the caravan was like a hedgehog with frayed hair, one by one showing their weapons and taking a defensive posture. Soon, regardless of the caravan ahead, the cavalry ran over on horseback, pulled out the daggers at their waists, and swung them at the dazed caravan with a burst of arc. Facing the well-equipped cavalry, the mercenaries resisted for a while, then fled on their own. Without any intention of dying for money, the cavalry chopped down a few fellows who tried to resist, and only then did the entire caravan calm down and accept their arrangement. Soon, a plump businessman was ready to negotiate, but Bull didn't have the slightest intention to respond as time was precious. But he didn't have that much time to talk to that group of greedy businessmen. Glancing sideways, one of the cavalry came out automatically, and said a few words to the dejected fellows, and then the entire caravan slowly started to move, but the target was no longer Norwich City, but 10 miles to the government army camp. In this way, with the entire caravan, Bull led a group of his men back to the camp. This is the third and largest caravan they brought back this morning. They worked so diligently, not only because of the order of the Marquis, but also because of the pound sterling hanging in front of them. Lord Marquis issued a statement that as long as a caravan is brought back, each team will get a glittering golden pound as their reward. Therefore, in Bull's view, these caravans are all gold coins. All our money is for how the Marquis of the caravan was blackmailed or threatened. Bull can't control that much. He only knows that they got rich this time. Chapter 269. The war is over. In this way, Marquis William scattered his cavalry and plundered the caravan around Norwich City for nearly a week. At this time, Norwich, who had been negotiating for a week, finally discovered a crisis. Your Excellency, there have been fewer and fewer caravans coming to Norwich recently. Various commodities in the city have begun to be out of stock, and the food reserves in our army have been declining. A short, fat middle-aged man, in an anxious tone, repeatedly reported to Sir Robert, who was busy with the files. William Cade is the logistics manager, but with his physical strength and spirit, he cannot take on this important task. Therefore, as an assistant, in fact, it is the short and fat man who has been in charge of the army's logistics, and this is also recognized by Robert himself. What happened? Sir Robert, who was originally calm, frowned and asked in a deep voice. Your Excellency, in the past week, all the caravans to and from Norwich have dropped sharply, and almost all the goods in the city have begun to run out of stock, and the number of leather and woolen goods in Norwich is increasing, and there are no more caravans. Acquisition: many factories have started to shut down, a large number of workers have lost their jobs, and the complaints in the city are getting louder. The short and fat man's face became more and more serious, his deep voice sounded in the room, and the atmosphere in the room also became solemn. Furthermore, the food in the army is only enough for 3 days. If we don't think about it, the consequences will be disastrous. More than 30,000 troops consume an astronomical amount of food every day, and the amount of food hoarded is only increasing. Of course, they are getting more and more nervous. This is bad news. Sir Robert almost frowned, and the wrinkles on his face accumulated one by one, which made people feel that the sir in front of him was already 57 years old. You have to hide it as much as possible. I will solve it as soon as possible, and the matter will be resolved soon. Sir Robert's eyes drifted away. He always felt that this was a hidden conspiracy. If he wanted to solve it in a short time, it would be easier said than done. A few days passed by, and the food and all kinds of goods in Norwich City decreased more and more, and the prices soared, but the supply was still in short supply. The food supply of every household in Norwich has bottomed out, and the resentment in the hearts of the people has begun to boil. The original dissatisfaction in their hearts has accumulated deeper and deeper at this time, and they can vent it out in one fell swoop just by waiting for the right time. Man, do you have the guts? Do you want your family to starve to death? Your hard-working wife, lovely son, do you want to watch them starve to death? A thin man was sitting on a wooden stake, and there was a man in front of him, slobbering recklessly, persuading him with righteous indignation, and everyone could see the expression of hatred in his eyes. But, Sir Robert is very kind to our family. If it were not for him, our family would starve to death. Todd sat blankly on the stake of his own house, listening to the words of the man in black in front of him. His heart felt like a knife was being cut, his face was full of tangled expressions, and his mouth was whispering softly. The man in black in front seemed to have heard Todd's whisper, walked up to him, and whispered in his ear, "Didn't you already pay it back? Don't think I don't know. You participated in the event at night, and you were among the group of people who opened the door, and you were even one of the initiators. Can't you return his kindness to you? Now, it's time to make another choice for my family." The man in black spoke softly, sentence by sentence, like a devil, and began to untie his knot step by step, full of temptation. When Todd heard these words, the tangled expression on his face gradually calmed down, and his head sank slowly. "Yes, I'm just a small adjutant of the city gate. Your Excellency's kindness has been repaid, so let's take care of my family now." Looking at Todd, who was persuaded by himself, The corners of the man in black's mouth slightly raised and his eyes narrowed slightly. It seemed that this mission was about to be completed, and the gate guard had already been persuaded. If he worked hard, he seemed to be promoted to a higher level, and the centurion must be within reach. After patiently persuading and firming up the city guard's belief in rebellion, the man in black walked away quickly. He didn't have much time. The city gate officer was Sir Robert's confidant, so he must not be able to persuade him. He could only persuade a few adjutants and a dozen small soldiers, so that he could launch in one fell swoop and succeed immediately. The dark night hides nowhere intrigues and tricks, and it is also the place where all kinds of wealth and opportunities are produced. Therefore, it is doomed that there is no way to survive at night. The next day, January 25, 1550, there was no more grain available in the market in Norwich, and all the grain stores were closed, and the residents of Norwich, who had been hungry for nearly 3 days, seemed to be "I can't stand it any longer." I don't know that it was organized and arranged by the people themselves. Thousands of residents shouted the slogan of bread and flocked to the cathedral in Norwich, the command center of the rebel army. In this regard, Sir Robert did not dare to act rashly, but arranged for the army to defend, and did not dare to expel the people. He knew that Norwich at this time was a crater, and if they were forcibly expelled, it was very likely to turn into a confrontation. In defending a city that has no popular support, how can it be defended? What's more, nearly 1/5 of the people in the army are residents of Norwich. After the evolution will confront, the morale of the army will be lost at this time. They have fully understood that this negotiation is completely a conspiracy, which is to take advantage of their illusionary psychology. Regarding this, Sir Robert looked at everything in front of him with a gloomy face, and he was fully able to guess the ending soon. During the confrontation, the gate of Norwich City was closed in the same way as it fell. In less than 10 minutes, Marquis William, who had been waiting for a long time, led an army of tens of thousands into the city of Norwich, where the gate was wide open. Faced with the sudden arrival of the king's army, the rebel army was in a panic, fleeing, surrendering, and resisting desperately. In this regard, Marquis William directly issued an order to kill all rebels who did not surrender soon. Blood flowers were floating in the city of Norwich. In the streets and alleys, there were shouts, begging for mercy, and fighting sounds, all kinds of sounds, and the killed bodies were randomly placed on the street, as if a toy is average in history. This uprising also ended in failure, because the leaders were optimistic and blindly believed in the words of the nobles and negotiated with the nobles, so that the government had time to recruit mercenaries and militias, so that the king's army calmly defeated them and was killed. Blood flowed like a river. Up to now, the northeastern part of England has kept a festival celebrating Kate's uprising every year. Chapter 270 Terrible Pension. After Norwich City was taken, the whole of England began to restore calm and peace, and the pockets of our king, the continuous flow of pound sterling, also began to stop. You must know that the local militiamen only serve the king for 1 month a year, and other than that, the rest of the salary is paid by the king on February 3rd. The good news from the northeast of England finally reached London. The nobles and commoners were not at all happy about the news of victory. In fact, apart from His Majesty the King, no one else in England cared a bit about these two riots. Your Majesty, according to the detailed reports of Marquis William and Knight Alexander, our finance office calculated the following data in 1 day. Edward reclined on his big seat, lazily opened his eyes, and listened to the report of Luna, the chief steward of the royal family and the director of the royal finance department, as the housekeeper. Luna can no longer be by Edward's side as before. The affairs of the royal family and court consume most of her time. Except for a few times a day, Edward hardly sees her. Edward squinted his eyes slightly, and carefully looked at the girl who had grown up with him. Feeling infinite emotion in his heart. The girl was 2 years older than him, and she was 16 years old. In this era, when she started getting married at the age of 13 or 14, she was relatively old. Her long flaxen hair was held up by a red robe, revealing her smooth forehead. On top of her green eyes were 2 slightly thick eyebrows. A mature and stable atmosphere, even with a domineering feeling. Of course, this is the feeling in the eyes of ordinary English men. John Bulls, who are used to machismo, will definitely not feel comfortable with this kind of attitude of women over men, and Edward turned his eyes back and forth on her, and nodded with a smile. Edward expressed his satisfaction for this kind of capable and beautiful Luna. In this society where women are dependent on men, it is difficult to see such a woman with a different temperament. A pair of white and tender long legs stood upright, which was extremely alluring to a man. It's just that there are no stockings. Alice, what a pity. Edward sighed silently in his heart. Your Majesty, In the past 3 months, the total expenditure of the royal family has reached £160,000. Luna's red lips parted lightly, her fat white and tender fingers lifted a piece of paper. She glanced sideways at the lazy young king with her beautiful eyes, rolled her eyes playfully, and then said softly among them, "The Devonshire where Alexander Knight is located, spent a total of £60,000, which took up to 2 months, of which £30,000 were spent on salaries, and £30,000 were spent on food and weapons. The army led by the Marquis Paul spent £100,000, and the total number of troops assembled reached 20,000, involving the 6 counties of East England. It took as long as 3 months. The total casualties of the militia are close to more than 6,000 people, and according to the regulations you promulgated, the total compensation for casualties and disabled soldiers has reached nearly £200,000. The pension regulations that Luna mentioned were issued during the establishment of the Guards. The standard of pensions was £10 for minor injuries, £50 for serious injuries and disabilities, and £100 for the families of those who died. Received from Royal Bank for the militiamen, pensions and so on are just floating clouds. Basically they have never seen or imagined such a thing. Serving as a soldier to eat food and make money is the consensus of all ordinary soldiers in Europe and even the world at present. As for the king, England, etc., this word does not exist in the soldiers' minds. Therefore, Edward has always been entangled in the pension of the militia pensionate. The number of militiamen who died is an astronomical figure. It can be said without hesitation that it can directly drag the royal family into bankruptcy, but if there are pensions, there are many benefits. First, it can win a lot of hearts for the royal family. You must know that every militiaman has a large family behind him. If a pension is issued to 1,000 people, it can affect at least a few thousand people, but this time, if pensions are issued to more than 6,000 casualties, it will affect at least 40,000 to 50,000 soldiers, and you must know that the total population of England and Wales is only 3 million at this time, which is not a small number. Therefore, Edward deliberated and decided to issue pensions to the militia, but the standard was directly cut in half, so that the royal family could barely support it. However, in this way, this number is also shocking, reaching a huge amount of 200,000. These 2 suppressions of civil riots directly cost as much as 360,000 yuan, which was almost the income of the royal family for a year. If his chief father Henry VIII encountered this incident, his first reaction would be to sell the land, and the second would be to borrow money simply. There were still close to £300,000 of income last year that had not been spent. And with the income from pubs and liquor sales in the past few months, the pension could barely be fully paid out. Luna, send someone to the Marquis of Paul and Knight Alexander to register in detail, record the wounded and dead soldiers, and try not to miss them. When Edward heard such a large number, he felt a little uneasy. He immediately sat up straight and ordered in a loud voice, "Such a huge number, if he does not conduct a detailed investigation and confirm it, he will not worry about the reports of those officials and military officers. And don't underestimate anyone's courage, especially plundering the money of those mudlegs. Don't put the money for buying people's hearts into other people's pockets, wasting his painstaking efforts in vain." "Yes, Your Majesty, I will send someone to follow up." Luna nodded lightly, and agreed. She was not at ease with such a large sum of money. Even if the king didn't say it, she would propose it to the king. "Well, you can talk to Adler Todd. After all, the money still has to go through the royal bank. Communicate in advance, and let him pay attention." "Okay, I understand." Luna agreed smartly, and stuck out her pink tongue mischievously. The original dignified director of the financial department of the royal family became a lovely maid immediately. She obediently sat beside the young king, massaging the king's shoulders with her slightly rough palms, with a fawning look. "You are so busy these days. I haven't seen you for a week." Edward fell back, his head lay directly on top of those huge breasts, soft and extremely comfortable. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelist. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 271. Jealous. Your Majesty, the royal territory has been a little unstable these past few months. Sir John and I have been running around for the past few months. Luna acted coquettishly at him with a coquettish voice. She didn't care about the young king's taking advantage of her. Instead, she straightened her back to make the king more comfortable. Sir John can do it alone. What are you going to do as the chief financial officer? Edward closed his eyes and felt a little peas on the back of his head. Instead, he swayed and rubbed mischievously, making Luna's face turn wine red, and the roots of her ears turned red. Your Majesty, don't I want to make a detailed statistics on the royal territory? Luna gently moved her jade hands with both hands, making the king's shoulders more relaxed, and her red lips were next to Edward's ear, gently blowing hot air. This made Edward tremble all over, and there were small bumps on his arms. It turns out that the sensitive part of the ear is the same for both men and women. Although Edward heard Luna's soft voice in his ears, he was thinking about it in his heart. I found that the parchments recorded by the royal family were all moldy. So I simply asked Sir John to take me around the various royal territories, and had a deep understanding of the territories, but the result was shocking. As soon as he heard the matter about the royal family, which was related to his own interests, Edward showed a bit of energy, turned his head, and asked in a teasing tone, "So, what did you find?" "My Excellency the Chief Financial Officer, Your Majesty," Luna said in a trembling voice with a long ending this time, "I found that the records of the royal family are completely outdated." When Luna heard the question, she straightened her face and said softly, "For example, the Duke of Cornwall has a recorded population of 26,000 people, but I found out that the population has reached 40,000. The Duchy of Lancaster originally registered only 50,000 acres of cultivated land, but I looked at it, and the lowest is 60,000 acres, and the highest, I estimate, may reach 80,000 pounds. Edward was a little surprised when he heard this number. He had already expected such a situation, not to mention in the 16th century, even in the 21st century, in the Great Heavenly Dynasty, there were not a small number of people who were concealed the past. Let it pass. Edward returned to his original lazy appearance, moved his head, found a comfortable position, and continued to lie down. In the future, you will be responsible for the statistical work of the royal territory. Edward closed his eyes, exhaled lightly, and said together with Sir John, "According to London's current 100 household and 1,000 household districts, reform all the territories of the royal family to be exactly the same. This is your task, but I just won't see you again, and I won't see you for a long time." When Luna heard this, her red face wrinkled, her lips turned red, her eyes turned red, and she said in a disappointed tone, "I haven't seen your Majesty for a long time." "Yes, your Majesty is accompanied by a beautiful female secretary. She hates our sisters." Speaking of that, Luna wiped the corners of her eyes that didn't exist on purpose, and came to Edward pitifully, looked into his eyes, and pretended to say pitifully, "Eh?" Edward saw that Luna, who had always been calm, showed a jealous expression, and his heart hurt a little. "It's better for little Mary, who has been nursed by me for several years, and doesn't care about it at all." Edward looked at Luna, who was pouting, sobbing from time to time, feeling a little emotional in his heart. Luna's behavior is something that Edward is used to. Normally, he has always been calm towards the two maids. Even if he made a mistake, he only clicked a few words and let it go. Compared with Henry VIII's random killing, much better. Therefore, Luna, who knew his temper well, dared to be jealous in front of him. If this was in other palaces, the spanked butts would have blossomed long ago. "Did Lucy tell you?" Edward took a breath and asked preemptively. "Yes." Luna sold her sister to Edward without any hesitation in her eyes. "Don't listen to her nonsense. Why would I hate you too?" Edward pulled Luna in front of him, wrapped his right hand around his waist, and completely embraced the girl in his arms, whispering softly in her ear, "You two have been with me for so many years, and you are so beautiful, understanding, and kind-hearted. How can I be willing to let you two go?" Edward sniffed vigorously on the girl's fair and tender long neck with his nose, and a unique aroma of his daughter's home rushed to his nose, lingering in his heart. It tasted so good. PFFT. It was rare for Luna to hear His Majesty the King speak so sweetly and coquettishly, and she burst into tears immediately. "Your Majesty, we are not as good as you say. We are just a little maid, with such a humble status. How can we be worthy of you?" As she spoke, the girl's voice slowly lowered, gradually no longer turning into a whisper, inaudible. Although Edward didn't hear the last few words, he still understood the general meaning. At this time, he suddenly realized why Luna started to go out so keenly. It was just for the girl to prove her worth to him. The same is true for Lucy. She stayed by Edward's side, tirelessly learning the recipes of various delicacies, serving the young king as much as possible, and satisfying his picky taste requirements. And all of this stems from his age. He is already 14 years old, and he is getting closer to the age of marriage, which makes the two of them feel a sense of crisis. Edward was a little touched by this, and the friendship he had been with for so many years came to his heart all of a sudden, and he was very moved, holding the depressed girl tightly, Edward comforted, "Aren't you the chief financial officer of the royal family now? I will never abandon you sisters. You must believe me. After a while, when you and Sir John are finished, I will take you two sisters to visit other places in England and have fun." How about it? Regarding the disparity in status, Edward has nothing to do. It is innate, so he can only spend a little time coaxing it. Thus, a parade plan that did not exist was established in this way and recorded in his schedule. "Really? Your Majesty?" Luna turned her head and confirmed, seeing Edward nodded. Her originally depressed mood suddenly became happy, and she regained her previous vigor. "Of course, this will have to wait for a period of time after the local reform, and by the way, we will also inspect it," Edward added in his mind. Chapter 272 The Condolences of the Royal Family. On February 8th, the sky in Norwich was still drizzled as usual, soaking the thin clothes of passers-by on the road, and the whole city was immersed in a kind of misty rain, which had a different kind of beauty. But in the eyes of the people of Norwich City, this drizzle is still so annoying. The cold, it's getting more and more aggressive, and even those whose family property is a little bit weak can't stand it. After all, when the weather is cold, the price of charcoal will rise again. It's so cold. My leg is getting worse and worse. On a wooden board covered with hay, a man in unlined clothing kept beating his left leg lightly, and the scar on his right face twitched from time to time. Obviously, his right leg suffered a lot of injuries. "Zuo-en, how are the wife and son you mentioned now?" Sigh. The man said a word of self-pity, then turned his head, and cast his eyes on his companion, who was in a daze, with some expectations in his heart, hoping to get a little comfort out. The companion on the side looked younger than usual, with skinny pimples growing on his shriveled face, no more than 18 years old in his old look. "Bruce, don't worry, I will send you home. After all, we are fellow villagers." When the young Zuo-en heard his companion say this, he thought he was worried that he would not be able to go home, so he quickly comforted him. "Besides, you promised me that you would marry my younger sister to me. For the sake of my future wife, I will not give up on you." The young Zuo-en fully remembered the care of his fellow countrymen in the past few months. He looked sincerely at Bruce, who had an injured left leg, and said word by word, "Hey, Zuo-en, I won't worry about going home." Looking at the young fellow in front of him, Bruce shook his head with a wry smile, sighed, and said slowly, "This time look at my leg. I think even the best doctor can't treat it, and I don't have that much money to treat this leg, so?" Zuo-en was a little uncertain in his heart, but frowned slightly, and still asked, "So, from now on, I can only live my whole life with a limp on a broken log, and become a useless person?" With that said, Bruce glanced at his injured left leg, thumped the wooden board under his buttocks hard, then heaved a sigh of relief, and said decadently this. Faced with ease, Zuo-en didn't know what to say for a moment. He just patted him on the shoulder, and kept everything in silence. In the countryside, a man is the pillar of a family. If the pillar falls, the family will collapse. If there is a problem with the pillar, the family will also slowly collapse, and the final result will be homelessness. In England, after farmers went bankrupt, they had to sell their land and wander around with their wives and children. Therefore, the young Zuo-en is used to seeing such scenes, but facing this fellow who has taken care of him for several months, Zuo-en still feels a little sad in his heart. All this is fate. Ever since the time of choosing to obey the call, everything has predicted this ending. Joining the battlefield is for money, and what you get is nothing but two results: returning rich, or returning injured or dead. Therefore, in the face of such a result, Bruce can only lament the bad luck, and will not regret participating at this moment. Bruce lying on the plank. He already had close to £5 in his pocket. In the countryside, you can live happily for several years, and you can also buy an acre or two of land to improve your family's life to a higher level. After comforting Bruce, Zorn turned around and went to the other side, happily touching the £3 in his pocket, grinning non-stop. When he participated in the draft for the first time, he got £3, which was his family's income for 2 or 3 years. With this money, he could marry a wife. Thinking of having a bed warmer every night. I can live like my elder brother, let my daughter-in-law yell every night, and I can shake my prestige in front of my elder brother. Two people, one thinking about how to add some new income to his family so that his life can continue if he is no longer the main beam after he is crippled, but the other was thinking about how to use the money he got to marry a daughter-in-law who could live a life, and he was very happy. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and a well-dressed young man walked in with a squeak sound, followed by a quiet young man, holding a quill pen in his hand and a splinter as white as blood. Seeing the two people dressed so brightly, Zuo-en and Bruce were taken aback for a moment, and their bodies couldn't help but tense up. Bruce, who had seen some of the world, felt that the two were different, so he hurriedly tugged on the sleeve of Zuoen, reminding him. Zuoen was dragged, turned his head to see Bruce's expression, and quickly reacted, helping Bruce to get up afterwards. The two made a knight salute to them in an awkward posture. Seeing this, the two people who came in felt awkward for a while. After Zuoen and the others finished saluting, the two young men also bowed slightly and returned the salute too. "We are commissioners sent by the king, and we are here to comfort these warriors who have served the royal family." The well-dressed young man took the lead and walked in front of the two, speaking in a calm tone. "Oh, it's His Majesty's. It's really an honor for us." Following the words of the gentleman in his own village, Bruce stammered, "Yes, we would like to ask, what are the names and addresses of the two of you?" When the glamorous young man asked, Wen Jingnan on the side picked up his pen and was about to start recording. "I'm from the town of Hannock in Southamptonshire. My name is Bruce. And this is Zorn." Hearing the question, Bruce said his information without hesitation, and then pointed to Zorn beside him. "Yes, my name is Zuoen, and I am also from Southamptonshire, Hannock town, but we are not from the same village." Zuoen on the side also reacted, and hastily explained, "Lest they delay their affairs, this is His Majesty's man. He is a big man, but he has to be careful in serving him. Even if he asks about bedwetting, he has to answer, maybe it's something big at this moment." These words welled up in the minds of both of them. "Very well, Mr. Bruce, your leg, oh, it was hacked by the mob." Hearing this, Bruce hurriedly explained, and even stretched out his injured leg for him to take a closer look. "So, Mr. Zuoen?" the young man asked Zuoen, who was a little dazed beside him. "There's nothing wrong with my leg." Zuoen quickly shook his head and denied. Chapter 273 Creata. Hearing this, the young man smiled helplessly, then held his patience and continued to ask, "Mr. Zuoen, is there nothing wrong with your body?" "No, I'm fine, nothing at all. Don't believe me, go out for a run." Only then did Zuoen come to his senses, and shook his head vigorously, fearing that they might not believe it. He wanted to set an example. "Okay, since you're fine, that's fine." The young man was confused, waved his hand, and said, "Okay, if that's the case." The young man turned his head and continued to Bruce, who was watching from the side. "Mr. Bruce, since you worked for the royal family and suppressed Robert Kate's riots, and your left leg was injured, you will die for life. Disabled." So, in 1550, February 8, Norwich City, dealt with by Mass. Lewis, beneficiary, Mr. Bruce from Hannock Town, Southamptonshire, amount, £25. While the young man was talking to himself, another quiet young man kept writing and moving his wrist, and the white paper and the rows of form boxes were filled with pen and ink. Immediately after seeing that the records were complete, Wen Jingnan took out a red stamp from his package. "Mr. Bruce, please stick out your thumb and press it." The glamorous man took the stamp, squatted down, and stretched it out to Robert's eyes, making a gesture of invitation. "Okay." After hesitating for a moment, Bruce pressed his calloused thumb on the stamp, and then pressed hard under the paper. "Okay, Mr. Bruce. We thank you for your cooperation." Mossy bent down slightly and said politely, "You're welcome." Bruce was so polite to the royal family that his neck was a little stiff. "This is His Majesty the King expressing condolences to you for being injured while serving the royal family. Please take it." Mars was polite for a moment, then took out a handful of golden gold coins in his package, counted them, and there were 25 before handing them to Bruce himself. Originally, according to the standard of the guards, the disability was £50, but these are all mine? Looking at the shining gold coins in his hand, he was dumbfounded. After a while, he raised his head with difficulty and asked about Mossy, who issued the gold coins. "It's true, Mr. Bruce." To this question, Mars showed a kind smile and said with a stereotyped answer, "This is the pension issued by His Majesty the King to show you warriors who have been deeply hurt by serving the royal family. Don't worry that we will go back on our word. If anyone dares to usurp it, report it to His Majesty the King. I think no one dares to offend His Majesty the King." In a flash, Mossy uttered this cliché that has been said hundreds of times verbatim, without blushing or panting. After saying these words, Mars walked out of the room and walked to another room. After the two members of the royal family left, Bruce and Zuoen, who were in a daze, finally realized it, especially Bruce. His whole body was like a ball of fire, almost burning. His face was flushed red. He stared blankly at the small pile of gold coins on the palms of both hands, turned his head, and asked Zuoen, who was also in a daze, "Zuoen, tell me, is this true?" Seeing Bruce with red eyes and a crazy expression on his face, Left swallowed his saliva and shook his head to wake himself up. Yes, Bruce, these are true. His Majesty the King gave you 25 pounds. Xuan stared wide-eyed, staring intently at the gold coins in Bruce's hands, nodded heavily, and said "Pa." Hearing Xuan's words, Bruce still couldn't believe it, and quickly slapped his face heavily with his right hand. Suddenly, there was a crisp sound in the room. Wow! A big slap made Bruce's nerves feel a little painful, but there was a joyful expression on his face, a kind of joy from the heart. It's true, Xuan, it's all true. Bruce shook Xuan's shoulder vigorously, making his head dangle back and forth, full of joy. Thank God. Thank you, father, mother, son, and thank your Majesty the King. Seeing that Xuan didn't respond, Bruce hurriedly made the sign of the cross with his right hand on his chest, muttering constantly, with a serious expression on the other side. Xuan looked at Bruce, who was praying with envy, wishing to replace him with his own body. But when I thought about my left leg being disabled and living my whole life crutching a log, this kind of jealousy turned into envy in an instant. Between 25 pounds and his left leg, he still chose his left leg. However, at this moment, he thought in his heart, if this is still the case in the future, I will participate next time. Luna screened and sent nearly 100 people to Marcus William, in groups of 2, to supervise each other, review and issue pensions in just 3 days. More than 3,000 wounded soldiers in the Marcus William team that had not been disbanded received the pension issued by His Majesty the King. However, more than 1,000 people who died in battle were still being released. After all, the journey was far away and the number of people was too large, so it would take more time for B. Edward directly ordered that no matter how long the time is, it must be fully distributed to their family members, so as to reflect His Majesty's love and care. After all, you have to do a full set of acting, and you can't be anticlimactic. However, just the disability pension gave Edward a lot of gratitude. It is conceivable that soldiers who have never received pensions will definitely be grateful to date afterwards, under the influence of them, neighbors, family members, friends, especially their next generation children. The admiration and gratitude for the royal family will definitely be planted in their hearts since childhood. In this way, the influence of the Tudor royal family on England will continue to increase, and the stable rule will last at least 20 or 30 years. In the past few decades, as long as Edward did not go too far, he would toss about the land of England at will without worrying about rebellion. At the same time, the army from the Knights of Alexander, the commissioner of the royal family, has also arrived, and in just a few days, they have also received a lot of gratitude. If Edward were a god, a string of faith lines would appear in his godhead, and he would gain a large number of believers. He has initially met the criteria for becoming a god. Not only is Edward not disgusted with this kind of god-making movement, but he will strongly support and encourage him to make himself a god walking in the world. What Edward wanted was the habit of ancient China. The emperor is above everything, everything is the minister's fault. The emperor is never wrong in this way, coupled with the tradition of blood being kings in the West. As long as the Tudor royal family continues, the rule will last for a long time, surpassing other dynasties. Chapter 274, The Villager Who Was Burned. The warmth-giving activity, which lasted for several days, instantly warmed the hearts of these militiamen who were about to return to their hometowns, and they felt a heartfelt gratitude to the king. 5 pounds for a minor injury, 25 pounds for a serious injury or disability. For these impoverished militiamen, it is a number that can change their destiny. Bruce, who had been enjoying himself all day, finally remembered that he would go home in a few days, and he still had to rely on his young fellow to take care of him. So, he turned his eyes and looked at the dark night outside the door, and with his still good right leg, he lightly kicked Xuan, who was curled up on the other side. Xuan, who had been thinking about marrying a wife, had a trace of saliva dripping from the corner of his mouth. When he was sighing for his bright future, he suddenly felt his leg was kicked. Don't think about it, this room is only big enough to hold 2 wooden boards. It can also be said to be an abandoned pigsty. Besides him, there is only Bruce with a crippled left leg. So, he put away the infinitely extended and beautiful future imagination in his head, turned sideways, frowned slightly at Bruce on the left, and asked impatiently, "What's wrong?" "Bruce, I'm getting married now." Upon hearing Xuan's complaint, Bruce smiled flatteringly. "Xuan, to be honest, I think you're a nice person. How about I introduce my sister to you?" "Ah, Bruce, are you serious?" Xuan didn't expect that the momentary joking words would be officially spoken out of Bruce's mouth at this time, and he couldn't believe it for a while. "This is not a joke, Zorn." Bruce shook his head, got rid of the smile on his face, and said seriously, "I see that you are a good person, So my sister married you, of course it is serious. Then, what does your sister look like? Is she a good child? Talking openly about his future daughter-in-law with others, Zuo-en suddenly felt a little shy, closing the distance between the two. With a shy smile on his young face, he asked softly, my younger sister is 14 years old. She has a round face, buttocks, and is healthy. She has never been sick and is a good child. And she never loses her temper. She can plow the fields, feed sheep. As he said that, Bruce got up and praised his sister one after another, which made Zuo-en's heartbeat start to speed up, and he kept nodding his head, looking extremely satisfied. He didn't pay much attention to the other things, and Zuo-en's heart was hooked by the words of being good at giving birth. What's the use of having a beautiful daughter-in-law, if she can't bear children? In his opinion, she doesn't even want to pay him back, and a person with a big butt that is easy to bear, not only can work, but also give birth to a few fat boys for him. This is the most beautiful life. Seeing the satisfied expression of his honest fellow, Bruce couldn't help showing a knowing smile, relying on this tall fellow. I will definitely return home safely, so I can rest assured. Bruce, who was comforted a lot in his heart, looked at Zuo-en's arm that was much thicker than ordinary people, and his face also smiled brighter. 2 days later, after all the pensions were issued, the conscripted militiamen were also disbanded. When going back, Bruce gathered some fellow villagers to go back together. Of the 8 people who came together, only 5 were left when they went back, and 3 of them were injured, and only 2 were intact, including the sturdy Zuo-en and a cross-eyed man. The 2 are the main staff, responsible for everyone's safety. Therefore, the 5 of them rented a carriage together. In this way, not only can some trophies be placed, but also the 3 sick patients can rest. To be precise, Bruce, who injured his left leg, can rest. Patients with 2 scars are in less demand. In this way, after walking for 5 or 6 days, several people returned to their hometown, Hanok Town, without any danger along the way. You must know that at the stall where the riot subsided, there were a lot of stragglers along the way, which was dangerous extreme. When we got to here, everyone went back to their homes and went to their mothers, but Zuo-en still accompanied Bruce, sending him home with a log on his left leg and supported by Zon. Bruce walked back to his home step by step. When they got home, Bruce's wife, a black and strong woman, came up to meet him. Looking at Bruce, who was limping, the tears in his eyes couldn't stop flowing, and he couldn't wipe them off. Behind him followed a girl with a slightly thin body. Of course, this was compared with the previous one. The girl's skin is wheat-colored, her height is medium, her arms and thighs look powerful, and it's no problem to chop wood to feed a horse. It's just that on the face of this strong body, there's a weak and lonely expression, which looks extremely restrained. Bruce walked forward on his own, and whispered to his wife while biting their ears, but Zuo-en's eyes were focused on his sister, without moving for a moment. Then, just like that, the family happily ate a sumptuous meal, and Zuo-en was also stayed for one night, but his gaze never took away from the girl's face, which made Bruce's family laugh from ear to ear the next day. The news of Bruce's return spread throughout the village in an instant, and with it, he brought back 30 pounds. This is not a big deal. Depending on your ability on the battlefield, you can earn more loot and leave less. It is up to God to decide. More importantly, among them, 25 pounds were issued by His Majesty the King, which is equivalent to waves rolling up on the calm river, and the hearts of the people in the whole village were shocked. It turns out that if you are injured, His Majesty the King still pays you. Is there such a thing as being a soldier? If I had known earlier, I would have applied. For a family that is so poor that only one person is left, let alone the regret in my heart at this time. The next day, almost everyone came to Bruce's house, one by one, to express condolences, with only a few words back and forth. Has His Majesty the King really sent someone to see you? Did I really give you money? My God. And then a bunch of prayers, and finally came a sentence, is your leg okay? Such a scene made Bruce overwhelmed, but he still patiently answered every sentence in the face of people from the same village. The whole morning passed quietly, but the hearts of the villagers gradually became angry. Everyone had only one wish at this time. His Majesty the King once again recruited the militia to fight. On the second day, the 2 young men came to the village where Bruce was. Under the witness of 100 people in the village, they handed over 50 pounds in the name of the king to the families of the militiamen who died in battle. At this moment, the entire village was completely ignited, like a burning bonfire. The heat was overwhelming. Everyone cautiously surrounded the 2 legendary envoys of the king, and asked softly, when will His Majesty the King recruit again? Chapter 275 Massacre. After suppressing the 2 biggest riots since he came to the throne, the young king suddenly found that he felt a little lonely for no reason these days. Food supplies were purchased from various counties, decrees were signed to mobilize militias in various counties, and some weapons were purchased from warehouses in Europe even. Edward is planning to send people to the German region to recruit mercenaries to join in the suppression of the riots. This is also the worst plan. After all, although the strength of the mob is not strong, the strength of the militia is not much stronger, and the difference in strength is not that great. Fortunately, in the end, even Marcus William, who had suffered a crushing defeat at the beginning, had a big reversal, which shocked Edward's jaw. After thinking about it carefully, the young king believed that with the help of Marcus William, he would definitely not be able to defeat the mob that had expanded to more than 40,000 people. Moreover, the strategy used was hard to figure out with his brain. There must be someone behind him. The corners of Edward's mouth curled up, his lips moved softly, and he said a wordless sentence just when the young king was very proud. "Zhi." There was a sound next to his ear, and Edward turned his head to see a pretty figure walking in. Lucy is 1 year older than Edward, so today's 15-year-old girl is like a flower bud, full of immaturity and youthfulness, not as mature, stable, or even perfectly developed as her sister, and Lucy's temperament is playful and full of youth. If I use one word to describe the whole thing, it can only be lively. Therefore, even though Lucy walked in with a maid's etiquette, holding a cup of tea, her steps were steady and powerful. However, Edward looked around her face, and the playful and lively aura could not be concealed even if he tried to hide it, and it was fully exposed. "Your Majesty, drink tea," Lucy said uncharacteristically, choking her voice, and said in a calm voice of, "Lucy, who are you?" The king opened his mouth in surprise, and asked the girl, who was very different from the past in doubt, "Your Majesty, I'm here to bring you tea." Lucy pretended not to understand, and said in a daze, her little face was full of innocent expressions, "My Lucy, you'd better go back to the original. I'm not used to you like this." Edward shook his head with a wry smile, and said to the maturely dressed Lucy, with a look of being overwhelmed. Seeing this, Lucy didn't take it seriously. She still straightened her body, and brought the tea in her hand step by step. Edward glanced at the steaming green tea, then at Lucy with an expectant expression, then picked up the cyan porcelain cup, aimed it at his mouth, and took a sip immediately. A hot current flowed from the throat to the chest, and the whole chest was warmed up immediately, and the fragrance of tea came out from the lips, which made Edward feel comfortable and relaxed. To be honest, even though he was the King of England, the tea he drank was not even as good as the dozens of Huangshan Maofen he drank in his previous life. However, as a young college student, Edward doesn't know much about drinking tea. He can only roughly tell whether it is good or bad hobbies. Therefore, it can be said that he is only slightly better than the cow chewing peony. Seeing the enjoyment expression on His Majesty's face, Lucy showed a sweet smile, with two naughty dimples on her face. Seeing Lucy's warm smile beside him, Edward felt even warmer in his heart. Wait, why is Lucy's small breast bulging? Yesterday it was a Fuji apple, but today it suddenly turned into a big pear. Is there such an operation? Lucy noticed that His Majesty's eyes were focused on her chest, and she didn't take it seriously at all. Instead, she retracted her stomach and straightened it up, which set off its incomparably tall and attractive size. "Lucy, you are beautiful today." Edward thought for a while, and praised the pretty Lucy. "Is this true, Your Majesty?" Lucy asked with surprise. When the king nodded, a flower bloomed on his face, bright and moving. "Sure enough, my sister is right. Your Majesty likes women with big breasts. Mine is still too small," Lucy thought silently in her heart, then turned her gaze down, glanced at her own small chest, and her eyes dimmed suddenly. "But today's you is still not as good looking as you were before." Edward shook his head, sighed softly, with an exaggerated expression of regret on his face. Seeing this, Lucy didn't know that His Majesty the King was comforting herself indirectly, and her heart suddenly became sweet. "Your Majesty, you've worked hard." Lucy walked behind Edward sensibly, gently pinching his shoulders with her small hands, rubbing two small bumps on his back from time to time, and the feeling was hard to explain. While Edward was enjoying himself, the door of the room was opened again. Edward turned his head and saw that the secretary Emma also walked in with two huge legs. Emma glanced at the king, and suddenly turned her eyes to Lucy behind him, her eyes flashing, full of inexplicable meaning. Then, with long straight legs, she walked to Edward's side step by step, holding her skirt, and gave a lady's salute. After that, he pretended to see Lucy's surprised expression suddenly, and after calling Sister Lucy, he saluted lightly, and Lucy also nodded kindly at Emma, and then her eyes slowly focused on her chest, and her pupils suddenly dilated, and Emma didn't know whether it was intentional or unintentional. She stood up tremblingly, but looked straight ahead, looking at the young king and Lucy. who had always been a little childish, suddenly saw this provocative movement, and the movement of her hands suddenly increased a little, and she clenched her silver teeth tightly. Edward reckoned that if her subordinates were not massaging her, they would have been wiped out long ago. What's the matter, Emma? Edward looked at the girl's secretary and asked strangely. Your Majesty, Norwich sent a letter saying that the Marquis of Paul massacred innocent people. It is conservatively estimated that at least 5,000 people were killed. Hearing this number, Edward trembled in his heart, and then calmed down. As a king, he is still sure of bearing this amount. With so many people, it must be the massacre of those mobs by Marcus William. Even some people who surrendered or fled. Marcus William's behavior is a common practice in this era. As for not killing captives, that is the treatment that nobles can enjoy. As for why there are so many people, I am afraid it is also the revenge of Marcus William for the last defeat. Fortunately, he didn't send troops to rob Norwich, otherwise, end of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.